There is a certain kind of beauty that does not invite you in. It dares you to kneel. Imagine, for a moment, a palace crouched beside the Atlantic like a jewel, dropped carelessly onto the rocks, windows glittering as though the sea itself were trapped in glass. Chimneys lined up with military discipline. Stone walls so confident they seem to believe they will outlast the planet. From a distance, it looks like triumph made architectural, the kind of home people whisper about with the same reverence they reserve for cathedrals. The kind of silhouette that makes strangers instinctively lower their voices. And yet, if you listen closely enough that you can hear the ocean inhaling and exhaling beyond the lawns, you begin to sense something else under the glitter, a faint, persistent tension, like a smile held too long. Because the paradox of this house is not that it is extravagant. America has always known extravagance. The paradox is that it is extravagant in a way that feels almost defensive. As if the building were not a celebration, but a rebuttal, an argument built in stone against an accusation that has never stopped circling its owners. You do not truly belong. Look at it again, the symmetry so precise it feels like control. The entrance so grand it resembles a courtroom. The carved details so lavish they border on intimidation. This isn't simply a place to live. It is a declaration written in marble, a proclamation delivered with chandeliers. And here is the first cruel truth, the one that turns the glitter sour on your tongue for all its magnificence. This house was never meant to be a refuge. It was meant to be a performance seasonal, punishing, relentless, like a play that cannot end because the audience is the entire nation and the critics never sleep. What does it mean when a home is designed not to comfort the people inside it, but to silence the people outside it? What does it do to a family? To be surrounded by beauty that behaves like a guard dog? And why would anyone build a palace so enormous, so meticulously perfect? Only to discover that perfection has a price that cannot be paid in money. Step closer, and the air changes. Even before you cross the threshold, you can feel the house working the way a machine works, quietly insisting that everyone who enters must take their proper place. The ocean wind is sharp, it brightens the skin. It clears the mind. It makes you feel momentarily honest. But the house is the opposite of honesty. It is a costume tailored from limestone and gold leaf, and it is heavy. The closer you get, the more the stone looks less like romance and more like armor. The stairs do not merely rise, they ascend. The doorway does not open, it admits. The facade does not welcome, it judges. If you have ever stood before something that is undeniably magnificent and still felt your stomach tighten, you already understand the first secret this mansion keeps. Splendor can be a kind of threat. Inside, just inside, you would expect warmth. You would expect the human softness that turns architecture into a home. Scuffed corners, careless laughter, the faint mess of living. But in houses like this, living is not allowed to be messy. Living is choreographed. Living is supervised. Living is a thing you do correctly. The way you do a dance at a ball when too many eyes are waiting for you to slip. The rooms are not merely rooms, they are stages. The ceilings do not simply shelter, they loom, painted and carved into elaborate stories that have nothing to do with the people beneath them. The columns stand like aristocrats at attention, and the floors polished to an almost unreasonable sheen reflect the light, as if they are desperate to prove they have nothing to hide. Even the silence is expensive. It is the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing, as though the building prefers you to breathe less. And that is the second cruel truth. Luxury can be suffocating when it is designed to impress rather than to embrace. Now picture the people who came here in summer, arriving with trunks and servants and schedules, arriving like a small nation, traveling with its own infrastructure. Imagine the first moment the family steps inside each season, the way the house must have greeted them with its unblinking perfection. No welcome back. No rest. Instead, perform. Imagine a mother smoothing the smallest wrinkle in a child's clothing because the walls themselves feel like they are watching. Imagine a father straightening his posture, not because he is tired of slouching, but because the portraits and mirrors and carved cherubs seem to demand a certain angle of pride. Imagine children learning early that their laughter must not echo too loudly, that their joy must not leave fingerprints. Because in gilded places, the most precious thing is not gold. It is control. And control, once it becomes a habit, is a hunger that never finishes eating. If this house could speak, it would not tell bedtime stories. It would recite a creed more. Bigger, finer, flawless. It would remind you that you are here not to be happy, but to be seen. So we have the glittering image, a seaside palace, a monument to wealth, a masterpiece of craftsmanship. But we also have the bleak underside, a home that behaves like a pressure chamber, where every chandelier is a spotlight and every corridor is a reminder that your worth is being measured. And here is where the paradox becomes almost unbearable, where the question sharpens into something you cannot ignore. If you can afford anything, if you can summon marble from Italy and artisans from across an ocean, if you can bend entire industries to your will, why can't you purchase peace? Why does the grandeur feel, in certain corners, like grief that has been polished until it shines? The answer, though we will not name it yet, is already hiding in the building's posture. This mansion is not merely an expression of taste, it is an expression of fear. Not fear of poverty money like this does, not fear empty pockets. It fears something colder, ridicule, exclusion, the possibility that the world will look at you, count your dollars, and still decide you are not worthy of the room. That kind of fear can make a person do extraordinary things. It can make them build a fortress that pretends to be a palace. It can make them decorate their walls with European echoes because the New World's applause feels too thin. It can make them treat a home as if it were a lawsuit against doubt. And once you see that, the house changes in your mind. It stops being merely beautiful and becomes deeply human, human in the most unsettling way, because it reveals how desperation can dress itself in diamonds. The sea outside is ancient and indifferent. It has watched empires rise and break like waves. The mansion, despite its confidence, sits on that shoreline like a dare to time. But time is patient. Time lets you build your masterpiece. Time lets you fill it with gold and laughter that sounds rehearsed. Time lets you believe you have won. And then, quietly, time begins to ask its own question. What happens when the people who built this monument to permanence discover that they are not permanent at all? What happens when the body, the fragile, exhausted, stubbornly mortal body cannot keep up with the empire it created? What happens when the heart, that small and fallible engine, refuses to be impressed by marble? There is an image I want you to hold on to as we begin, a throne made not of wood or metal, but of rooms, rooms stacked upon rooms, corridors like rivers, staircases like declarations, a throne that demands you sit upright forever. Because this house, for all its beauty, does not feel like a place where you can collapse. It feels like a place where collapsing would be unforgivable. And yet, people did collapse, not always in public, not always dramatically. Sometimes they collapsed in the quieter ways that never make headlines: sleeplessness, irritability, marriages that grow brittle, children who learn to behave like dolls, adults who become addicted to appearances. Sometimes the collapse is the slow realization that you have built the perfect cage and then handed yourself the key, only to discover your hands are shaking too much to turn it. So let me ask you the question that matters. The one that will pull us through every glittering detail and every shadowed corridor that follows. Is this mansion a triumph, or is it evidence? evidence of what a person will do when admiration becomes oxygen, evidence of how beauty can be weaponized, evidence that wealth can create an echo so loud it drowns out the sound of your own life. You came here, perhaps, expecting a story about architecture, about styles and artisans and stonework and the kind of craftsmanship that makes historians sigh. You will get that, yes. But if you stay with me, you will also get something stranger and sharper, a psychological portrait disguised as a building. Because a house like this is not passive. It has an agenda. It tells you what its owner wanted the world to believe. And if you pay attention to what it refuses to say, if you notice the coldness beneath the gold, you begin to glimpse the private cost of public grandeur. This is the beginning of the film, inside the documentary. The moment the camera lingers too long on the sparkling surface, and you realize the sparkle is not joy. It is tension. The ocean keeps breathing. The mansion keeps shining. And somewhere inside that shine is a man or a family trying to prove, with every carved detail, that they are untouchable. But here is the most tragic truth of all. The harder you try to become untouchable, the more you reveal where it hurts. The man who builds a palace rarely begins with brick. He begins with a bruise. Before there were foundations dug into the stubborn earth, before the first shipment of stone arrived like a procession, there was something far less visible and far more decisive, a private conviction that ordinary success was an insult. He did not wake up one morning and think, I would like a larger living room. He woke up with a sharper thought, one that tasted faintly of metal. I will not be diminished. People like him do not simply desire comfort, they desire correction. They feel, somewhere deep behind the ribs, that the world has misjudged them. And the only acceptable response is to build a counterargument so monumental that doubt feels ridiculous in its shadow. This is how obsession begins, not as vanity, but as a certain kind of panic wearing expensive clothes. Imagine him in the early years, before the mansion existed, when his name was already known, yet still not sufficient. He attends dinners and rooms glittering with other men's confidence. And even if no one says it out loud, he hears it anyway in the pauses, in the glances, in the polite laughter that comes half a beat too late. New money, improvised elegance, a fortune that arrived too quickly to be trusted. He may have more dollars than the old families. But dollars are not the same as belonging. Belonging is heritage. Belonging is taste. Belonging is being unbothered by the need to prove anything. And there is nothing more unbearable to a man who has clawed his way upward than the implication that he is still, in some essential way, uninvited. So he starts to dream, not of a home, but of a verdict. He wants architecture that functions like a final word. He wants a house that ends the conversation. You can almost see the moment the idea turns from desire into fever. Perhaps at a party where someone's European chandelier earns more admiration than his latest business triumph. Perhaps at a seaside promenade where rival families display their summer cottages like peacocks display feathers. Perhaps at a dinner where a woman, an in-law, a rival, a social oracle with perfect posture, mentions a certain estate with a tone that implies he could never match it. In that instant, the mansion becomes less a project and more a duel. He is not competing with comfort, he is competing with contempt. And contempt, unlike money, cannot be bought. It must be conquered. This is where the psychology sharpens. He does not merely want to be admired, he wants to be undeniable. He wants the very people who hesitate to accept him to feel, for one sickening moment, what it is like to stand outside something they cannot afford to ignore. He wants to invite them in. Yes, but not as guests. As witnesses. In the mind of the builder, the house becomes a courtroom and the world becomes a jury. Every hall will be an exhibit. Every staircase will be testimony. Every imported panel, every hand-carved cornice, every ceiling painted with mythological scenes will whisper the same message: I am not temporary. I am not provincial. I am not beneath you. And there is a darker edge to that message. The one obsession always carries like a blade tucked under velvet. If you will not respect me willingly, you will respect me because you have no choice. He begins to collect architects the way generals collect strategists. He does not want someone who can merely design. He wants someone who can translate hunger into stone. He studies styles not as a scholar, but as a conqueror, looking for the vocabulary that will make the loudest statement. Renaissance grandeur, French symmetry, Italian marble, English gardens disciplined into submission. He wants references that smell like old Europe, because old Europe is what the American elite uses as a seal of legitimacy. It is not enough for the house to be big. It must be fluent in the language of lineage. It must look as though it could have existed before he was born. That is the deepest trick to manufacture history, to build a memory that never happened. Because if he can make a house that feels ancient, then perhaps his fortune will feel less like a fluke and more like destiny. And so his obsession takes a shape, not merely to outshine his rivals, but to rewrite the story in which they get to judge him. Yet obsession is never pure. It is always braided with other motives, some noble in their own twisted way. There is ego. Yes, the narcotic pleasure of imagining crowds gasping, of imagining newspapers reporting not just his wealth, but his taste. There is spite, the delicious idea of building something that makes a rival's home look suddenly modest, even embarrassing. But there is also fear, and fear is the most honest fuel of all. Fear of being forgotten, fear of dying and discovering that the world did not notice, fear of being reduced to a footnote in someone else's ledger. The mansion becomes a kind of immortality machine. If his body is mortal, his walls will not be. If his reputation is fragile, his stone will not be. He wants to leave behind something that cannot be argued with. A monument, yes, but also a shield against the terror of insignificance. And once that kind of fear has found a blueprint, it doesn't let go. The project expands the way a storm expands, quietly at first, then with a momentum that frightens even the people who benefit from it. The budget grows, but budgets are irrelevant now. He is buying a feeling. And feelings do not come with price tags. The plans multiply. The rooms proliferate like evidence. A ballroom, not because he loves dancing, but because space itself is a form of dominance. Dining rooms, not because he craves intimacy, but because he wants dinners that resemble ceremonies. Libraries, not necessarily for reading, but for the symbolism of wisdom displayed behind glass. Bedrooms, not merely for sleeping, but for hosting. Enough suites to accommodate a rotating cast of admirers. Enough corridors to keep servants invisible. Enough staircases to ensure that the house can move people like pieces on a chessboard. In his mind, the mansion is a machine for manufacturing awe. And awe is addictive. Every time he imagines a guest gasp, his own heartbeat steadies. Every time he imagines his rivals forced into admiration, the old bruise feels briefly numb. But numbness is not healing. It is only delay. Here is the cruel mechanics of obsession. The more it gives you, the more it demands. At some point, the house stops being something he builds and becomes something that builds him. His days are no longer measured by sunrises, but by progress reports. Shipments, artisans, disputes over details that no one will consciously notice yet will, in his mind, determine whether the entire performance succeeds. He becomes a man haunted by minutiae, the exact shade of gilding, the angle of a balustrade, The way light falls through a window at 4 in the afternoon. The house invades his thoughts the way a lover would, except this lover never softens, never forgives, never says you've done enough. He begins to speak of the building as if it were a living thing, because in a sense it has needs, appetites, rhythms. It is never finished. It is always asking for one more flourish, one more imported piece, one more statement to ensure the world will finally be quiet. And what about the family? Here the obsession becomes contagious. A spouse, initially dazzled, learns to live inside a vision that is not hers. Children grow up hearing the house discussed like a deity, revered, feared, appeased. Servants learn its labyrinthine logic, the secret routes, the backstage passages that keep the illusion pristine. Everyone becomes an employee of the obsession, whether they are paid or not. Even affection becomes scheduled. Even rest becomes conditional. The mansion is not merely a residence, it is a regime. And regimes, as history repeats, are good at making people forget what freedom feels like. The builder may tell himself he is doing it for the family, for legacy, for security, for a future that looks respectable. But look closer. Legacy is often just ego in a family suit. Security is often just fear wearing a tie. The truth is that he is building because he cannot stop, because the world made him feel small once. And he has sworn that it will never happen again, even if it costs him everything softer than victory. There is a particular cruelty in that vow. It sounds like strength, it sounds like determination, but it is also a trap. Because if you build your identity on never being diminished, then you are always at war with rivals, with critics, with whispers, with time itself. A man like that cannot relax inside his own success. He can only escalate, and the house becomes the escalation made visible. It is important to understand this before we enter the rooms, before we let our eyes feast on marble and chandeliers, because otherwise you will mistake the mansion for a dream. It is not a dream. It is a symptom. It is the physical manifestation of an inner argument that never ends. And here is the question that hovers like a chandelier above the whole enterprise. If the house is meant to prove his worth, what happens if it succeeds? What happens if the world applauds? Does the applause quiet the fear, or does it teach him that he must never stop performing? Because admiration, once tasted, has a way of turning into a dependency. Now imagine the first summer the mansion stands ready enough to inhabit. The builder walks through it, not with the relaxed stride of a man coming home, but with the alertness of a man inspecting a battlefield after victory. His eyes move quickly, evaluating, correcting, anticipating criticism. He is not asking, will we be happy here? He is asking, will they be impressed? That is the telltale sign. Happiness is private. Impressing is public. And a home designed for the public is not a home. It is a mirror. And mirrors, as every myth warns, can become cruel. So when we step into the next part of this story, into the gilded cage itself, remember that every shimmering surface began as an emotion. Every arching corridor is a sentence in the builder's private diary, written not in ink but in stone. The mansion is beautiful, yes, but it is also desperate, and desperation, no matter how elegantly dressed, always leaves fingerprints. The first thing you learn when you walk into a house built to win is that beauty can be loud without making a sound. The door yields, and the air changes cooler, heavier, as if the building has been holding its breath for decades and you have interrupted it. Light enters in disciplined angles, not casually, not generously, but with the calculated grace of theater. And there it is, the grand hall. the ceremonial throat of the mansion, where marble doesn't merely cover the floor, it declares itself. The stone is polished to a mirror sheen, veins running through it like pale lightning, imported at a cost that could have fed a neighborhood, laid with the devotion of craftsmen whose names will never appear on the plaques. It is stunning. It is impeccable. It is also, in the most literal way, cold? Yes. The floor is a masterpiece. But it steals warmth from the soles of your feet even in summer. You can almost feel the house reminding you, from the first step, this is not a place for softness. This is a place for composure. The ceiling rises above you like a verdict. There are chandeliers whose crystals catch and fracture light into 1,000 obedient sparks, light so refined it becomes almost sterile. The walls are paneled, carved, gilded, ornamented with flourishes that look like celebration, until you notice how controlled the celebration is. The curves are precise, the symmetry relentless. Nothing is allowed to be accidental. Nothing is allowed to be human. And here begins the technique. The house performs again and again the yes. But yes, it is magnificent. But it is magnificence with an edge. Yes, it dazzles. But it also disciplines. It makes you stand straighter without asking. It makes you lower your voice. It makes you feel oddly as though you might stain it simply by existing. You move forward, and the corridors open like promises that refuse to be intimate. The scale is the first seduction. Rooms here are not sized for conversations. They are sized for statements. A drawing room with sofas arranged like diplomatic furniture, spaced carefully so that even closeness feels curated. Yes, the upholstery is sumptuous, but the arrangement prevents anyone from collapsing into comfort. A music room where sound would bloom? Yes, but bloom like a performance, not like a family humming to itself at dusk. And then the dining room, because every empire, even a social one, must have a room where power is consumed. The table is long enough to look like a river of wood and linen. Silver glints. Porcelain sits with the calm arrogance of objects that have never known a dishwasher. The ceiling above may be painted with gods and mythic abundance, as if to reassure the guests that excess is sacred. Yes, it is grand, but the space is so vast that laughter thins out before it reaches the far end. Families in rooms like this must speak loudly to be heard, which means even affection sounds like an announcement. Meals become ceremonies. Tenderness becomes formal. The room eats intimacy the way the ocean eats sand. And the yes, but returns. Yes, you can host the most important people in the country. But can you whisper to the person you love without an echo turning your words into spectacle? Now imagine the life inside this gold cage. Not from the angle of a guest. Guests see only the silk surface, but from the angle of a resident, especially a child. The architecture teaches lessons without admitting it is teaching. Hallways are long, so children learn early that running is dangerous. Not because they'll fall, but because sound travels. Sound travels too well. Sound announces. A dropped spoon becomes an event. A giggle becomes something you must hush. And so the children grow careful, not because they are naturally quiet, but because the house trains them like it trains everyone else to preserve the illusion. Yes, they live in splendor, but splendor becomes a rule book. Their day is structured like a ritual. The right clothes for breakfast, the right clothes for walking outside, the right clothes for visitors, the right clothes for dinner, 7 changes a day. Not because the body demands it, but because the image demands it. Their bodies become mannequins for a family myth, and the servants always the servants. The invisible bloodstream of any gilded empire move through the house like ghosts with perfect posture. There are hidden staircases. service corridors, doors that blend into paneling so seamlessly that the house itself seems to have secret veins. The staff must appear when needed and vanish immediately after. Because the luxury is not merely in having help, it is in pretending help does not exist. Yes, the house is full of life, but it is a life that must not be seen. This is a cage made not of bars, but of expectations. And expectations can be heavier than iron. Walk with me into the bedroom suites, and you will see another trick of gilded living, privacy that is not quite privacy. Bedrooms are large, yes, but they are arranged like satellite stations in a network of status. Who sleeps where is not just a matter of comfort, it is a matter of hierarchy. The best view, the most elaborate fireplace, the suite closest to the grand staircase. Each choice is a message. Each choice is a chess move. Yes, there is space, but the space is political. Even rest is ranked, and the bathrooms marble again, mirrored again, gleaming surfaces that make the human body look temporary. Yes, there are tubs wide enough to feel like pools, but in a room so cold and echoing that the water seems to lose heat faster. As if the building resents warmth, you can bathe like royalty. Yes, but you will still shiver. The house is always slightly ahead of you, always reminding you that it belongs not to you, but to the idea of you. Now step into the library, a room designed to signal intellect even if no one reads. Shelves climb the walls, filled with bindings chosen as much for color and prestige as for content. There is an odor of leather, of polished wood, of time artificially aged. Yes, it looks like wisdom, but it is wisdom displayed, staged, curated. The quiet here is not the quiet of thought, it is the quiet of surveillance. You can almost feel the portraits watching from above the fireplace. Ancestors and allegorical figures rendered with the calm confidence of people who never worried about bills or gossip. Their eyes follow you, not literally, but psychologically, which is worse. They remind you that you are living in a lineage you had to manufacture. Yes, the room is a sanctuary, but it is also a reminder that sanctuary was never the point. The point was proof. The point was to show to visitors and to rivals and to the future that the builder belonged among the eternal. And what about the ballroom? The shimmering heart of the performance. It is a space designed for bodies to move like planets in a social solar system. The floor is sprung, perfectly engineered for dancing. The walls are gilded, the mirrors tall enough to multiply the crowd into a small army of elegance. Yes, the room is breathtaking, but it is also merciless. In a ballroom, you cannot hide. Every posture is visible. Every misstep becomes a tiny scandal. Every woman's dress becomes a public statement. Every man's confidence becomes a currency. The room is built to turn people into ornaments. It is visual porn. Yes, the kind that makes you gasp, yet it is also an engine of pressure. You can imagine the heat of summer evenings, the weight of fabric, the brightness of light reflecting off jewelry, the forced smiles. You can imagine how exhaustion would feel like a secret weakness. Because weakness does not belong here. The yes, but becomes almost cruel, yes. You can dance under chandeliers that cost more than a house. But can you breathe without remembering that you are being measured? Even the pleasures have a penalty. Consider the gardens outside trimmed hedges, disciplined lawns, fountains that throw water into the air like applause. The grounds stretch like a kingdom designed to make the ocean itself feel like a decorative feature. Yes, it is paradise, but it is a paradise that requires constant labor. 1,000 small hands to maintain the illusion that nature here has been tamed gracefully. The roses bloom? Yes, but they bloom on schedule. The grass is green. Yes, but it is green because people's backs bend to keep it that way. The house insists on order everywhere, even in leaves, and order. When it becomes absolute, becomes fragile, it cannot tolerate the mess of reality. It must constantly fight, and fighting is exhausting. Now, if you were a guest arriving for a summer weekend, you would see only the magic. You would step out of your carriage, your car, your imagined arrival, and feel yourself swallowed into wealth, so total it seems like weather. You would be guided by staff who move like choreography. You would admire a staircase so grand it makes your own life feel suddenly small. You would sip something cold, something sparkling, and you would think this is the pinnacle. This is what winning looks like. But if you were the one who lived here, if you were the child who must behave, the spouse who must host, the builder who must prove your relationship with the same beauty would sour. Because beauty, when it is used as a weapon, turns on the hand that holds it. The gilded cage does not slam shut all at once. It closes softly, politely, with velvet hinges. It tells you that you are lucky. It tells you that you should be grateful. It tells you that millions of people would kill for this life. And yet, inside, you begin to notice the costs that do not appear in photographs. The way a room this large makes loneliness feel theatrical. The way constant perfection makes you afraid to relax. The way servants' presence, however discreet, means you are never fully alone. The way guests arrive like tides, and you must always be ready. The way the house never sleeps, because there is always something to polish, something to prepare, something to hide. Yes, you are rich, but you are also employed by your own image, and the house is your boss. Here is a small detail that reveals the entire truth: doors. In ordinary homes, doors are practical, they separate, they protect, they offer privacy. In mansions like this, doors become instruments of theater. Double doors that open wide for entrances, tall doors that make even adults look slightly smaller, doors that announce status, which rooms are allowed to be entered, which rooms remain closed, which corridors are for family, which are for staff, which are for guests. Yes, there are many doors, but they do not simply offer choices, they enforce categories. The house teaches everyone their place. It teaches it gently through design. And because it is gentle, it is difficult to rebel against. The rebellion would feel like a breach of etiquette, a sin against beauty. So the people adapt, they smile, they host, they endure. And endurance is the quiet heartbeat of the Gilded Age, the ability to keep shining even when the body wants to collapse. In these rooms, every candlelit dinner is a performance. Every morning is a reset. Every summer is a campaign. You can see how it would grind a person down in ways no guest would ever suspect. The house gives you everything except ease. It gives you splendor instead of softness. It gives you admiration instead of rest. It gives you the illusion of control. And then, slowly, it reveals the trap. The illusion requires constant maintenance. You cannot stop, because the moment you stop, the whispers return. The moment you stop, the rivals breathe easier. The moment you stop, the whole point of the mansion, its function as proof, begins to decay. So you keep going. You keep hosting. You keep polishing. You keep changing outfits. You keep playing your role. And the house watches, silently approving only when the performance is flawless. This is why the Gilded Cage is so effective. It does not imprison you with force. It imprisons you with prestige. It makes leaving feel like failure. It makes complaint feel ungrateful. It makes exhaustion feel shameful. And when shame becomes part of your daily air, you start to crack, not visibly, not at first, a sharper tone at breakfast, a headache that lingers, a marriage that begins to feel like a partnership in public relations rather than love, children who learn to smile for strangers better than they smile for their parents, a builder who grows restless, even in his triumph, because triumph is never enough when it was built to heal an old bruise. And so, somewhere in the middle of this visual feast, amid marble and gold leaf, amid chandeliers and sea air, something begins to shift. Not in the architecture, but in the people. A hairline fracture appears, invisible to guests, but felt at night when the house finally quiets and the ocean's breathing grows louder than applause. The gilded cage remains gorgeous. It remains pristine, but the occupants begin to carry a new weight, the sense that the house is not just a trophy, it is a demand. And demands, sooner or later, collect their payment. Every empire has a moment when the music keeps playing, but the dancers start to tire. From the outside, nothing changes at first. The chandeliers still glitter. The invitations still arrive, thick as cards of authority. The sea still throws light against the windows like applause. The guests still step into the grand hall and feel the familiar shock of wealth so absolute it resembles weather. And yet, beneath the performance, the first crack begins the way all real disasters begin, quietly, almost politely, like a hairline fracture in porcelain. There is no single trumpet announcing, now the fall begins. There is only a subtle shift in rhythm, a pause that lasts too long, a laugh that sounds practiced instead of effortless, a host who grips the back of a chair a little tighter than usual, a servant who learns to move even more silently, because tension has entered the house, and tension hates to be witnessed. The crack is psychological before it is financial. It is bodily before it is public. It is the human refusal to keep pace with an image that demands endless perfection. Picture the builder now, not as the visionary stalking through blueprint dreams, but as the man who has reached what he thought was the summit, only to discover summits are exposed, cold, and lonely. He has the house. He has the view. He has the rooms that make rivals swallow their envy. He has won the performance, and still the fear does not leave him. That is the bitter joke of obsession. It promises relief, but relief is not included in the purchase. The builder wakes up one morning and feels his body betray him in small ways. A tightness in the chest, a heaviness behind the eyes, a fatigue that no amount of luxury can disguise. He ignores it because men like him are trained to treat discomfort as weakness and weakness as an insult. He keeps going. He keeps hosting. He keeps building the myth of invincibility. But the body is not impressed by myths. The body keeps its own ledger. Then comes the first undeniable moment, perhaps a public event where he must stand too long and the room begins to tilt. Perhaps a dinner where the fork feels heavier than it should. Perhaps a morning when the ocean air is sharp and instead of refreshing him, it feels like it is cutting him open. He might retreat to a private room, frustrated with himself as though he has failed at being immortal. He might insist it is nothing, but those close to him, his spouse, his physician, his most loyal staff begin to notice the difference. The builder is still powerful, yes, but his power now has an edge of fragility. And fragility in a house like this is dangerous, because the entire structure is built to deny it. The fall does not come as a dramatic thunderclap right away. It comes as a new kind of silence, a silence that is not expensive, not curated, but ominous. The house begins to feel too large. Rooms that once served as stages now feel like distances between a person and the help he refuses to admit he needs. Corridors stretch longer. Stairs feel steeper. The grand hall looks less like a triumph and more like a reminder of all the energy it takes to cross from one end of your life to the other. And yet the guests still come. Because the social machine does not pause simply because the host is human. Invitations are obligations. Appearances are currency. If the builder falters, the world will interpret it as weakness. And weakness is the one thing he cannot tolerate. So he continues, wearing health like another costume, smoothing pain into a smile the way his household smooths linen into perfect folds. But the crack spreads. It spreads into the family, because a household built on performance cannot easily handle vulnerability. A spouse grows anxious, not only out of love but out of dread if he falls. What happens to the entire architecture of their identity? Children begin to sense that the fortress is not as unshakable as it seems. Servants overhear murmured conversations in private corridors. The house, that great disciplined machine, begins to carry rumors the way wind carries salt. Then, at some point, always sooner than people expect, the fall becomes visible. A stroke, a hard event, a collapse that cannot be gilded away. It happens with brutal indifference to the calendar, because illness does not care if the season is high society's favorite. One day, the builder is the sun around which the house's orbit turns. The next day, he is sitting, diminished, his body suddenly a stranger to him. And the image is unbearable. The man who built a palace to prove he was untouchable now sits in a wheelchair, staring out at the ocean that never needed his approval. The sea continues. The mansion continues. But the builder's body has issued its final critique. It is not a gentle critique. It is a verdict. In that moment, the house becomes something else. Not a weapon, not a trophy, but a witness. Its corridors, once designed for triumphal entrances, now measure the slow progress of weakened steps. Its grand staircase, once a symbol of ascent, becomes an obstacle. The ballroom, once alive with movement, becomes a cavern of absence. And the yes, but turns crueler than ever. Yes, you built a monument, but you cannot climb it. Yes, you purchased grandeur, but you cannot purchase strength. Yes, you made the world look at you, but now you cannot bear to be seen. This is the emotional peak, the moment when the gilded cage reveals its true nature. It was never built for comfort. It was built for display. And display is merciless when the human being on display begins to break. The fall is not only physical, it is social. People in the builder's world are drawn to power. And when power wavers, their loyalty becomes complicated. Some visitors come with genuine concern, but even concern in these rooms feels performative. Others come to observe, quietly, like vultures disguised as friends. They stand in the grand hall and admire the architecture while their eyes inevitably flick toward the diminished man. In their minds, a thought forms that is as old as society itself. So this is what happens. The builder feels it. He feels the subtle shift in how people speak to him, the way their compliments become careful, the way their laughter becomes too loud, as though they are trying to hide the awkwardness of mortality. He might retreat. He might become irritable. He might grow quieter, not because he is calm, but because he is furious with a universe that refuses to honor the logic of his wealth. And then comes the next crack, money. Not because the family is suddenly poor, no, not that kind of fall. The fall of great fortunes is rarely instant. It is erosion. It is the slow realization that maintaining a palace costs more than building it, because maintenance is eternal and humans are not. The staff wages, the repairs, the heating, The endless polishing, the gardens, the replacements, the seasonal rituals. A mansion like this consumes resources the way a large animal consumes oxygen. As long as the builder is strong, the consumption feels justified. It is part of the myth. But once he is weakened, once the house becomes less a stage and more a burden, every expense begins to feel like a question. Why are we doing this? And questions are dangerous. Questions spread. Children grow up, and their relationship to the obsession is different. They did not build the palace. They inherited it, which means they inherit not only the beauty, but the obligation. Some want to maintain it out of loyalty. Some resent it. Some see it as a trap disguised as privilege. The family begins to disagree, not necessarily loudly, because loud disagreement would crack the image. But in the quiet way, that is worse. Through distance, through coldness, through decisions made without speaking. And the house listens to all of it, indifferent. It's stone incapable of affection. Now the scandals, if they arrive like sparks near dry paper. Perhaps an affair, because performance marriages often leave people starving for something real. Perhaps public criticism, because society loves to build idols only to enjoy the moment it can criticize them. Perhaps a business downturn, because no empire is immune to shifting winds. The exact shape of the scandal matters less than the fact of it. The myth begins to tarnish. And once tarnished, it cannot be polished back into innocence. The house that was built to end the conversation becomes the center of a new conversation. One the builder never wanted, not how magnificent, but how fragile. This is where the rhythm of the story accelerates. The mansion, once a slow tour of splendor, begins to feel like a chase. Decisions must be made. Assets must be evaluated. Pieces of the collection, artwork, furniture, silver, tapestries begin to leave. At first it might be subtle, a painting taken down, replaced by something less important, a room closed for repairs, but really because fewer spaces are being used. A reduction in staff, explained away as efficiency, but felt as absence. The house begins to empty like a lung exhaling. And for those who know how to read wealth, emptiness is louder than gold. Because gold says, we can afford this. Emptiness says, we can no longer justify it. Imagine the family walking through rooms that once existed to impress guests. Now quiet, now echoing in a different way. The ballroom silence no longer feels expensive. It feels abandoned. The dining room table, once set for dozens, now sits like an artifact. The grand hall is still grand, but grandeur without energy is eerie. This is the psychological horror inside the documentary, the realization that beauty does not protect you. It simply survives you. The builder, if he is still alive, watches all of this with a particular kind of torment. He built the palace to prove permanence. Now he is forced to watch it become evidence of impermanence. The house remains. He diminishes. His rivals, his critics, time itself, none of them had to lift a finger. The body did the work. The calendar did the work. The universe did the work. There is a moment, often, when the builder understands the truth he spent his entire life trying to outrun. The ocean does not care who owns the coastline. The sea will outlive every fortune. And no amount of marble changes the fact that you are made of flesh. That moment is both tragic and strangely pure, because it strips away the performance and leaves only what is real, a human being facing an ending. The fall culminates, eventually, in one of history's familiar scenes, a death, a funeral with expensive flowers and carefully curated grief. Headlines that speak in respectful tones while quietly preparing to move on. The house, this once private kingdom, begins to shift into a different kind of existence. Perhaps it is too costly to keep. Perhaps the family cannot agree. Perhaps the world has changed, and the old rituals no longer feel glamorous but grotesque. The mansion that was built to declare this is ours begins to slip toward this was theirs. Ownership turns into memory, and memory, unlike stone, fades. So the fall is complete not when the builder dies, but when the house stops functioning as a living stage and begins functioning as a relic, when staff are reduced to caretakers, when rooms are roped off, when visitors stop being personal guests and become strangers who bought tickets, when the private becomes public. That is the final humiliation for a house built out of pride, to become an exhibit. And yet, paradoxically, it is also the only way such a building can survive. A palace cannot remain a palace forever. It must either be abandoned, destroyed, or transformed, and transformation is its own kind of death. The crack has spread into a fracture. The fracture has become a fall. The mansion still stands. Yes, stone is stubborn, but the life it was meant to glorify has ended. And now the story must ask the question that always comes after spectacle collapses. What remains? After the fall, the strangest sound is not silence. It is footsteps. Footsteps that do not belong. Footsteps that wander without permission, without anxiety, without the old choreography of status. The mansion, once a private argument against doubt, wakes up one day to find itself inhabited by strangers, ordinary people carrying cameras, wearing comfortable shoes, speaking at whatever volume their bodies naturally choose. And the house cannot stop them, because the house has changed categories. It is no longer a throne. It is an artifact. It is no longer a fortress of belonging. It is a monument to a question. Time has done what time always does. It has taken the human urgency that built the place and replaced it with public curiosity. Now, the Grand Hall does not host rivals. It hosts tourists. The marble still shines. The chandeliers still throw light like scattered diamonds. The ceilings still perform their mythological dramas, yet the emotional temperature is different. The building, stripped of its original purpose, feels almost honest. It no longer has to pretend to be a home. It can simply be what it always secretly was, a stage set made permanent. People come in with brochures and guided tours. They pause to admire the carvings. They tilt their heads back until their necks ache, taking in the ceiling's painted gods. They exhale little sounds of admiration that would once have pleased the builder. Oh, how he would have wanted to hear them. But the admiration now is weightless. No one's life depends on it. No rival is being humiliated by it. No spouse is exhausting herself to maintain it. No child is being trained into a doll. The applause is not oxygen, it is entertainment. And that shift, that loss of necessity, is the mansion's true aftertaste. It shows you the difference between awe and meaning. Awe can be purchased. Meaning cannot. Here is the cruel irony that forms the echo. The builder wanted to be undeniable to his contemporaries. Yet the contemporaries are gone. The ones who whispered new money. The ones who withheld belonging. The ones whose approval he tried to win with stone time has erased them all with equal indifference. Their names are footnotes. Their rivalries are dust. The mansion remains, yes, but it remains in a world where the original social war no longer matters. Visitors look at the house and feel amazed, but they do not feel the old tension. They see splendor without sensing the panic that created it. They treat the palace like a beautiful corpse, fascinating, polished, and utterly detached from the pain of its last breath. And perhaps that is the final humiliation. Not that the house became public, but that the house became safe. Safe enough to be consumed as leisure. Safe enough to be reduced to fun facts. Safe enough for children to run through the gardens and for couples to take selfies where once a family's reputation was guarded like a military secret. The gilded cage becomes a museum. And museums have a gentle cruelty. They preserve the surface while draining away the urgency. So what remains of the builder's obsession? Not his fear, not his sleepless nights, not his simmering resentment, not the particular ache of needing to prove that you belong. Those are not preserved in glass. What remains are the tangible consequences, the stone, the woodwork, the chandeliers, the cold marble that still steals warmth from your feet. What remains is labor fossilized into beauty, the invisible hands of artisans and servants and builders embedded into every panel. What remains, too, is the lesson that always arrives late, when it can no longer save the person who needed it. Because standing here now, in the echo of a dead performance, you begin to feel the philosophical question rising like fog. What was all of this for? If the house was built to silence doubt, why does doubt survive in a different form? Doubt not about wealth, but about purpose. Doubt about the worth of spending a human life chasing admiration that cannot follow you into death. Doubt about whether a palace is a triumph or simply a very expensive way to avoid looking inward. And the mansion, in its current form, answers without speaking. It answers by existing as evidence. Evidence that human beings can pour their souls into stone and still not find peace. Evidence that the world will always move on. Evidence that permanence is a costume, and time eventually sees through costumes. Walk through the rooms now, as a modern visitor might, and you can almost feel the ghost of the original function. The ballroom's vastness still hints at nights when bodies moved under chandeliers like constellations. Smiles pinned in place. Music swelling to drown out exhaustion. The dining room still suggests dinners where conversation was less about connection and more about power. Who sat closest? Who was invited? Who was excluded? The bedrooms still carry the chill of luxury that was never allowed to become messy. The servants' passages still whisper of lives lived in invisibility, of human effort hidden so thoroughly that even now you might miss it unless you look for the seams. And that, perhaps, is the most honest echo. The house exposes the cost not only to the wealthy but to everyone orbiting them. The mansion is a monument to hierarchy. It is a sculpture made of inequality. Yet the public tours, with their polite fascination, often soften this truth into harmless spectacle. Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it extraordinary? Isn't it a different world? But the deeper lesson is not aesthetic. The deeper lesson is psychological. Because the house shows you what happens when a person confuses being seen with being loved. When a person tries to purchase belonging with grandeur. When a person believes that if he builds something large enough, it will contain his fear. Fear is not contained. It leaks. It stains. It finds its way into every room. The gilded cage is beautiful, yes, but it was never built for joy. It was built for reassurance, and reassurance, unlike joy, must be constantly renewed. It is a drug that wears off. Now, in the present, the mansion functions as a different kind of reassurance. It reassures the public that wealth is not immortal, that even the richest families become history, that even the most confident stone eventually becomes a backdrop for strangers who do not care about the original drama. And perhaps this is why people love visiting such places, not only because they are gorgeous, but because they offer a quiet comfort. Look, even this ended. Even this could not last. The palace is proof that time is the ultimate equalizer. And that proof is oddly soothing to those who live ordinary lives. It tells them that the elite are not gods, only humans with larger costumes. So the echo is layered. For the public, the mansion becomes entertainment. Inspiration, a postcard of opulence. For historians, it becomes a record of an era, a physical document of how America performed its wealth. For the descendants, it becomes complicated, pride braided with discomfort, legacy braided with burden. And for us, as listeners, as witnesses in this story, it becomes a mirror held at an angle that reveals an uncomfortable truth. We all build something to prove we belong. Not necessarily mansions, sometimes careers, sometimes reputations, sometimes relationships, sometimes social media personas, sometimes careful, polished versions of ourselves. The scale differs. But the psychological mechanism is familiar. The desire to be undeniable, the fear of being dismissed, the hunger for applause. And the mansion warns us, gently but firmly, that applause is not the same as peace. The most haunting part is that the builder probably did not see this lesson clearly until it was too late. He may have sensed it. In small moments at night when the house was quiet and his heartbeat sounded too loud in the enormous bedroom, on mornings when the ocean looked more eternal than any stone, in the brief, sharp emptiness that follows a successful party, when the last guest leaves and the rooms feel suddenly like props. But sensing a truth is not the same as accepting it. Acceptance would require surrendering the obsession. It would require admitting that the house was never going to heal the bruise. And men like him are not trained to surrender. So the echo lingers, a gorgeous building that outlives the reason it was built. Standing like a question carved into coastline. If you could talk to the builder now, if you could stand him beside you in the grand hall, among the tourists, among the cameras, among the easy laughter, what would he feel? Pride. Perhaps that the house still commands attention. Rage. Perhaps that the attention is no longer his. Grief. Perhaps that the people who mattered then are gone. Or maybe in some impossible moment of clarity, relief, because the performance has finally ended. And he is no longer required to keep shining. That is the ultimate tragic tenderness, the idea that death might be the only thing that can free someone from the cage they built to protect themselves. And so we arrive at the question that remains after every gilded story fades into history. Wrote Cook, Teka sotiendo de lamji, to impress people who are now dead, to create a beauty that is now consumed casually, to build a shelter that never truly sheltered. The mansion cannot answer with words, but it answers the way architecture always answers, by continuing to exist. Cold and magnificent, offering us the chance to learn what the builder could not or would not learn while he was alive. It offers us an aftertaste, admiration mixed with melancholy, awe mixed with unease. It reminds us that the grandest cages are the ones we build willingly, and that the key is often in our own hands long before we notice the doors locked. On a hill above the Pacific, where fog drifts like slow breath and the coastline curves as if the earth is trying to remember its own elegance, there stands a palace that looks less like a home and more like a dare. From below, it appears almost unreal, twin towers rising like a cathedral that forgot to choose between God and glamour, terraces layered with balustrades, gardens arranged as if nature itself signed a contract to behave. In the late afternoon, when the sun strikes the pale stone, the place seems to emit its own light, as though wealth has become a weather system and this is its brightest storm. You can picture the scene without effort, a road winding upward through oaks, a sudden reveal, then that impossible skyline, Mediterranean fantasy perched on Californian earth, a European dream transported, assembled, polished, and commanded into existence. It is one of the most extravagant private estates ever built in America. A trophy on a mountaintop, a monument that says, in the oldest language of power, look at me. But here is the paradox that makes the beauty turn sharp in your mouth. The man who imagined this palace, who poured into it not only money but appetite, taste, and a kind of imperial longing, did not die here in triumph. Surrounded by the full completion of his vision, he died far away from it, and the palace itself never truly finished becoming what it was meant to be. How does that happen? How does a man gather enough power to summon an entire mountain into ornament, yet still lose the one battle? The building was secretly designed to win the battle against emptiness. The first time you hear its nickname, it sounds like a fairy tale, a castle on the coast. Castles are supposed to be ancient, rooted in centuries, defended by history. This one was built in the 20th century by an American who was not born into medieval bloodlines, but into modern machinery, newspapers, influence, celebrity, an empire of attention. The castle's true material is not only stone, it is ego refined into architecture. And yet, for all its theatrical confidence, the place carries a faint scent of something unfinished, not merely in construction terms, but in emotional terms, like a sentence that refuses to end because it cannot decide whether it is a victory or a confession. The paradox hook is simple and brutal. This is a palace designed to look eternal, but it is haunted by the fact that its owner was deeply, painfully human. The hilltop is majestic, but the man's final years were not. The facade promises dominion, but the story underneath is a story of craving applause so vast it needed towers and pools and imported ceilings to contain it, and yet still could not contain it. When you imagine the golden age of this place, it is easy to picture it as pure celebration. The richest guests, the most famous faces, movie stars laughing under chandeliers, politicians listening carefully, artists pretending they are not impressed even as their eyes betray them. You see silk dresses, tuxedos, cigarettes glowing at the edge of night. The Pacific in the distance like a dark mirror reflecting the party back to itself. You imagine an orchestra, the clink of glasses, the soft choreography of servants moving like shadows so the illusion never breaks. On paper, it reads like the pinnacle of American fantasy. A private mountaintop where the world's glittering people come to orbit a single man's magnetism. But then the biographical shadow creeps in, and suddenly the scene changes temperature. Because this castle was not born from domestic need. It was born from appetite, an appetite for spectacle, for significance, for a kind of belonging that money can imitate but never quite secure. Its owner could command attention on a national scale, could bend narratives, could manufacture reality for millions. And yet he still felt the urge to build a physical proof that he mattered. Why would a man who already owned the minds of a country feel compelled to own a mountain as well? What does it say about power when it cannot sit quietly inside itself? The castle's most seductive quality is how confidently it borrows from older worlds. Its towers echo Spain. Its courtyards suggest monasteries and palazzi. Its interiors are stuffed with European fragments, ceilings, tapestries, carvings, objects that once belonged to other centuries, other empires, other myths of legitimacy. It is as if the builder, despite being the product of modern America, wanted to wrap himself in the aura of antique authority, to wear history like a cloak. And that is the first hint of insecurity, the urge to import the appearance of lineage. The castle is not simply luxurious, it is referential. It is trying to speak in an accent it was not born with. It is trying to convince the world, and perhaps its owner, that this is not just money. This is culture. This is permanence. This is destiny. But destiny, as the ocean will always remind you, is not something you can purchase. Destiny does not arrive in shipping crates. So when you stand before this hilltop palace, you are looking at a contradiction made visible. You are looking at a place that performs certainty while quietly carrying doubt like a hidden organ. And the most unsettling part is that the doubt is not about whether the castle is impressive. It is undeniably, violently impressive. The doubt is about why it needed to exist at all. Because homes are usually built to shelter, love, rest, family, privacy. This was built to shelter a persona. It is a stage set scaled up to geography. It is a monument to a man who lived in public and feared the moment the public might look away. And here is where the paradox hook deepens into something almost tender. The more spectacular the castle becomes, the more it exposes the hunger that fed it. This is not the hunger of poverty, not the hunger of survival. It is the hunger of someone who has everything except satisfaction. Someone who can purchase art but cannot purchase stillness. Someone who can invite the world to his table but cannot silence the one quiet question that waits at the end of every party. Is this love, or is this only admiration? The ocean below does not flatter. It does not care about towers. It keeps breathing, indifferent, ancient, repeating itself. The castle, perched above it, looks like an attempt to interrupt that indifference, to carve a human signature into the landscape so bold that even nature must acknowledge it. Yet nature never truly acknowledges. Fog arrives anyway. Wind erodes anyway. Salt gnaws at stone anyway. Time does its slow work. And the builder, despite all his influence, cannot veto time. There is something almost cinematic about the hill itself, a place you ascend to, a place you reach like a climax, a place that demands an entrance. That alone tells you this was never meant to be merely inhabited. It was meant to be approached. It was meant to be revealed. It was meant to create an emotion in the visitor before the visitor even steps inside. Awe first, then submission, then gratitude for being allowed into the aura of another person's power. The paradox is that this emotional machine, perfected to produce awe in others, may have produced something very different in the man who owned it: restlessness, anxiety, the gnawing pressure to keep elevating the spectacle, because spectacle is the only language he trusted to keep the world close. The richest irony of all is that castles, historically, were built for defense. They were built because danger existed outside the walls. But this modern castle's danger was not an invading army. It was invisibility. It was irrelevance. It was the idea that the builder might one day be reduced from Titan to trivia. So he built walls against forgetting. He built towers against dismissal. He built pools against the dryness of ordinary life. He built terraces against the fear that the world would not be impressed enough. And in doing so, he created a place that looks like security while actually revealing the insecurity that built it. If you could freeze the castle at its most glamorous moment, cars arriving, guests stepping out, cameras flashing, laughter rising, you might believe you are seeing happiness. But happiness does not usually require this much architecture. Happiness does not need a mountaintop. Happiness does not require towers to prove it exists. Which brings us to the question that should snag in your mind like a hook in silk. If the castle is the ultimate symbol of excess, why does it feel, in certain angles of light, like loneliness petrified into stone? Why does a place designed to host the world carry an undertone of isolation? Perhaps because the higher you build, the farther you are from ordinary ground. Perhaps because a hilltop palace, by definition, separates you. Perhaps because the very act of making yourself untouchable also makes you unreachable. And that is the paradox we begin with. A palace so magnificent it resembles immortality, built by a man who spent his life controlling narratives yet could not control the narrative that matters most. The one written by age, by the body, by the slow closing of doors. The castle's beauty is the bait. Its hidden tragedy is the line. It invites you to gawk, then quietly asks you to pity. It tempts jealousy, then replaces it with a colder curiosity. What kind of person needs this? Not wants, needs. What kind of inner weather drives someone to turn a mountain into a mirror? And what happens when that mirror stops reflecting applause and starts reflecting the owner's own exhaustion? This is where we begin our new journey. Not with dates, not with blueprints, not with a polite history lecture. We begin with the contradiction, because contradiction is where human beings reveal themselves. A castle that promises eternity. A man who could not finish it. A party that looks like paradise. A loneliness that might have been the true resident all along. So tell me, standing at the base of that hill, staring upward at stone that pretends to be a dream, do you feel admiration? Or do you feel a faint chill? And if you feel the chill, are you ready to follow it inside? William Randolph Hearst did not build on that hill because he needed shelter. He built because his life had taught him a more dangerous hunger than comfort, the hunger to be unavoidable. When you spend your days shaping headlines, bending public mood with ink and outrage, you begin to believe the world is clay, and you are the hand. You learn the intoxication of influence, the private thrill of knowing that a sentence you choose in the morning can make strangers furious by noon, can crown a hero, can ruin a reputation, can turn rumor into reality simply by repeating it with enough confidence. That kind of power is not merely professional, it is psychological. It rewires the soul. It teaches you that attention is not a byproduct of meaning, but a substitute for it. And once you have tasted attention at scale, ordinary life becomes too quiet to tolerate. Hearst's castle begins. Then, as an extension of his most basic instinct, if the world can be curated on paper, why not curate reality itself? Why not create a physical headline, a permanent front page made of stone, towering above the Pacific, so that even the landscape cannot ignore your name? But obsession is never just one thing. It arrives braided like a rope, and every strand tightens when you pull. There is the strand of inheritance. Because Hearst did not rise from nothing. He rose from a fortune that came with expectations. A kind of gilded destiny that can feel like both gift and sentence. Money inherited is a strange kind of pressure. It gives you the means to do anything. But it also dares you to prove you deserve the means. It whispers that you must not merely spend, you must transform. You must justify. You must become more than a rich son. You must become a myth. In that sense, the hilltop becomes a stage for a very American anxiety. The fear that wealth without artistry is vulgar. Wealth without culture is temporary. Wealth without spectacle is forgettable. Hearst lived in a country still young enough to be insecure. A nation with money growing faster than its history. He could purchase influence, yes. But could he purchase legitimacy? Could he purchase the feeling that his empire was not just loud, but grand? The castle is one answer, and it is an answer delivered with theatrical certainty. Yet behind that certainty, the obsession pulses with something softer and more personal, the desire to be loved on purpose. Hearst's life was drenched in public attention. But public attention is promiscuous. It gives itself to whoever shouts best. What he needed was devotion that felt intimate, chosen, anchored. And so the castle becomes not just a monument to power, but a kind of love engine, a place designed to gather people, to keep them close, to make their admiration feel less like a crowd and more like a court. Imagine the psychology of that. A man who can command millions through print, still wanting a room full of famous faces laughing at his jokes. Still wanting the warm proof of proximity. Still wanting to look across a dinner table and see gratitude reflected back at him like candlelight. He builds terraces for promenades, not because he loves walking, but because he loves being watched while walking. He builds guest rooms the way a monarch builds alliances, each suite a promise, each invitation a thread tying someone important to his gravitational field. He creates a mountaintop because mountaintops are metaphors. They separate you from the ordinary. And separation can be mistaken for greatness. Yet the higher you place yourself, the more you must work to keep people climbing up to you. That is the cruelty of elevation. It flatters your ego while threatening your loneliness. And Hearst, for all his public bravado, carried a private knowledge that loneliness is not cured by crowds, it is only distracted by them. Obsession loves distraction. It feeds on it. The castle begins to grow in his mind, not as a project, but as a world. And worlds have rules. In Hearst's world, reality must feel curated, because the uncurated is unpredictable. And unpredictability is the one thing a man of narratives cannot tolerate. He chooses an architect not merely for skill, but for the ability to translate fantasy into logistics, to take fever dreams and make them stand upright. He collects objects from older continents, not simply because they are beautiful, but because they come with built-in gravitas. A European ceiling is not just decoration, it is imported authority. A tapestry is not just fabric, it is time you can hang on a wall and pretend you own. And here the obsession reveals its deeper, almost childlike logic. If you surround yourself with history, perhaps history will adopt you. If you live among relics, perhaps you will become one. The castle becomes a collage of centuries because her psyche is doing what many powerful people do when they sense the fragility of their era. It tries to steal stability from the past. New power is always a little nervous. Old power sits still. Hearst wanted stillness, but he did not know how to ask for it directly. So he asked for it in stone. There is also the strand of rivalry, because men who rule through spectacle cannot stop comparing. A newspaper war is not just business. It is a duel for dominance of mind space. And dominance, once you need it, becomes a lifestyle. Hearst is not satisfied to be rich, he must be singular. Not satisfied to be influential, he must be legendary. In that mindset, a mere estate is insufficient. An estate is something other wealthy people have. A castle is something people whisper about. A castle is a headline that never fades. And the hilltop location is not accidental. It is the physical enactment of his psychological posture, above. Above competitors, above criticism, above ordinary constraint. You do not simply visit a place like this. You ascend to it. The act of arriving becomes a ritual of submission. Even before the first chandelier, the guest has already participated in the story. Hearst wants to tell. This is a man worth climbing for. But notice the shadow inside that desire. If you need people to climb to you, you are admitting, without saying it, that they might not come on their own. The castle, in that sense, is a preemptive defense against neglect. It is Hearst's way of saying, even if you try to ignore me, you cannot ignore this. The building is a megaphone made of limestone. Yet obsession always asks for more volume, because fear is never truly silenced, only drowned out. And Hearst's fear, beneath the bravado, is simple. The world moves on. Headlines expire. Even empires of attention eventually lose their grip. The public is fickle, and the public is not sentimental. The crowd that cheers you today can yawn tomorrow. For a man who lived by capturing attention, the idea of being out of fashion is not merely inconvenient, it is existential. So the castle becomes his attempt to anchor himself in something heavier than paper. Paper burns, stone remains. That is the seduction. But stone also exposes, because stone is honest about scale. when you build something this large, you reveal that you feel something inside you is not large enough. The castle is not just an expression of confidence, it is a compensation, a way of externalizing an inner appetite that cannot be satisfied internally. And then there is the strand of romance, because even the most powerful men want to be understood in a way power cannot purchase. Hearst's public identity was thunderous. But public identity is armor. Armor protects you and isolates you at the same time. So imagine the relief of creating a private kingdom where you can decide who sees you, and how a place where you can shape the lighting, the mood, the guest list, the narrative of the evening. A place where you can turn life into cinema and cast yourself not as villain or mogul, but as host, patron, genius, lover, king. The castle is the ultimate editing room. Hearst cannot control every headline forever, but he can control what happens on his hill. He can produce weekends the way he produces newspapers, with planning, spectacle, and a keen sense of what sells. And what sells best, always, is myth. So he makes his life mythic. He builds pools that feel like Roman fantasies because Rome is shorthand for empire. He builds towers because towers are shorthand for permanence. He fills rooms with artifacts because artifacts are shorthand for legitimacy. He designs experiences because experiences are the currency of devotion. And all of it serves a singular psychological purpose, to make the people around him feel they are living inside something extraordinary. Because if they feel that, they will associate the extraordinary with him. They will love him not just as a person, but as an atmosphere. That is a more durable kind of power than politics. It is emotional monopoly. Yet, even as the castle gathers people, it also reveals the cost of gathering. The more you rely on spectacle to maintain closeness, the more closeness becomes conditional. Guests come for the glamour. Yes, but glamour has to be renewed like fuel. The moment the parties stop, the mountain becomes very quiet. And quiet is dangerous to a man whose life has been loud. Quiet invites thought. Quiet invites the possibility that you might look around your own palace and realize you built it not because you were full, but because you were hungry. Obsession hates that realization. So it keeps moving. It keeps adding. It keeps collecting. It keeps perfecting a new ceiling, a new shipment, a new garden access, another guest suite, another object with a story older than America, another detail to distract from the one detail that cannot be revised. The human heart is not impressed for long. The human heart wants more than spectacle. It wants rest. It wants safety. It wants to be loved without needing to earn it with fireworks. Hearst's tragedy, if we dare to call it tragedy, while standing amid such excess, is that he tried to solve emotional hunger with architectural abundance. He tried to replace inner quiet with outer noise. He tried to make permanence by stacking beauty on a hill until beauty resembled destiny. And like many men with immense power, he did not notice how power can make you less free. The castle, while it looks like ultimate freedom, is also ultimate obligation. Once you build a world, you must maintain it. Once you invite people into a myth, you must keep the myth alive. Once you become the center of an orbit, you must keep spinning. Because stillness would reveal that the center is just a person. And a person is fragile. That is the psychological engine of Hearst Castle, ego. Yes, but ego is a shield. Love, yes. But love as a performance, culture, yes. But culture is camouflage. Power, yes. But power as an addiction. The castle is his autobiography written in stone. And every chapter whispers the same refrain: do not look away. The obsession is not merely to be rich or famous. The obsession is to be necessary to the conversation, necessary to the imagination, necessary to history. And yet, history is a cold lover. It takes what it wants and forgets the rest. Which is why Hearst did not just want to be remembered, he wanted to be preserved. The castle is preservation in physical form. It is a museum built while the owner still breathed. A way of turning his own life into an exhibit before death could do it without his permission. But that is also where the obsession becomes almost unbearably human. The underlying plea inside all that grandeur is simple. Stay. Look. Admire. Choose me. Don't let me vanish. And now that we understand the hunger behind the hilltop, we are ready to step into the gilded cage itself, because the next part is where the obsession becomes tactile. It becomes marble underfoot, gold overhead, water shimmering like a promise, and the persistent, quiet undertone that no amount of beauty can completely erase. Yes, it is paradise. But paradise built to impress is never entirely comfortable. The ascent to the hill is already part of the spell. Your body climbs before your mind has decided what to believe. And by the time the towers come fully into view, you have been prepared, oxygen a little thinner, horizon a little wider, the world below reduced into something small and manageable. That is the first luxury Hearst sells you. Altitude is authority. Then you cross into the estate and the atmosphere changes from California to somewhere else, as if geography has been bribed into silence. Courtyards open like theatrical pauses. Stone warms in the sun and cools in the shade with the indifferent patience of old monasteries. The architecture speaks in borrowed accents, Spanish, Italian, vaguely ecclesiastical, yet it speaks with American volume. And the first sensation is intoxicating. It is hard not to feel that you have entered a dream curated by someone who believed reality was negotiable. Yes, it is breathtaking. But it is also immediately clear that you are not here to relax. You are here to be impressed. Every turn is a reveal. Every walkway is a camera move. Every stair is a cue. The estate does not allow you to simply arrive. It makes you perform the act of arriving. Walk into the main spaces, and the interior hits you with a different kind of weather. Opulence that is not soft but sharp. Rooms are stuffed with objects that carry the weight of other centuries, carved doors, painted ceilings, tapestries that look like history woven into fabric. The lighting is chosen to flatter surfaces, glints off gold leaf, gentle halos around chandeliers, shadows that make corners look more mysterious than practical. You can smell it. Wax, polished wood, old textile, stone that holds coolness like a secret. It feels like walking into a collage of Europe assembled by a man who wanted every inch of his environment to whisper that he was not merely wealthy, but cultivated. Yes, it is exquisite, but it also feels curated to the point of anxiety. The rooms do not breathe the way living rooms breathe. They pose. They hold their posture. They seem to ask you, without saying it, to mind your body. Don't slouch. Don't touch. Don't be too real. The yes, but begins here, quietly, like a thread pulled tight. Yes. You are surrounded by beauty, but the beauty is watching you. Then the famous pool appears in the imagination like an icon, the Neptune pool, open to the sky, framed by classical columns and pale stone, water glimmering with that particular blue that looks almost mythological, as if the pool is not filled with water, but with a distilled idea of paradise. You can see how it would stun guests, the audacity of it, the way it makes the Pacific seem like a supporting actor. Yes, it is one of the most spectacular swimming pools ever built. But think about what it means to swim there. You are swimming in a stage. Every splash is visible. Every wet footprint becomes a mark on perfection. Even leisure becomes exhibition. The pool promises freedom. Water is always a symbol of release, yet in this setting it also becomes a mirror. You are not simply enjoying yourself, you are being enjoyed by the gaze of others. And the gaze, even when it is admiring, is a kind of pressure. Hearst understood that he built pleasure that behaves like theater. And theater, by definition, has an audience. Move deeper into the property, and you find the other famous water temple, the indoor Roman pool. A room that feels less like a swimming facility and more like a jewel box designed for a god. Tiles in blues and golds cover the walls and ceiling with obsessive repetition. Patterns that wrap the eye until the room feels like it is humming. The air is cooler here, damp with chlorine and stone, echoing softly. Yes, it is stunning, almost hypnotic, but there is something claustrophobic about a pool indoors, surrounded by ornament on every surface. The decoration does not stop. The patterns do not rest. Your eyes cannot find a plain wall to lean on. It is as if the room refuses simplicity, and simplicity is sometimes what the nervous system needs most. You can imagine guests descending into it and feeling both awed and slightly trapped, as though they have stepped into a beautiful vault. Water that should feel liberating instead feels ceremonial, controlled, enclosed. Yes, but yes, you can swim like a Roman emperor. But the room is so perfected, it makes even your body feel like an intrusion. Now imagine the guest suites. They are called cottages, which is the kind of joke wealth tells itself with a straight face. Each is a miniature kingdom, decorated with seriousness, designed to make a visitor feel cherished and, at the same time, gently indebted. Plush beds, antique furniture, views that frame coastline and sky as if the world is a painting hung for your exclusive enjoyment. Yes, it is hospitality at the highest level. But there is a subtle trap in such hospitality. When everything is provided, so is a certain loss of agency. You eat when the house eats. You gather when the schedule gathers. You follow the rhythms of the host's narrative. Your freedom is real, but it is bounded by the invisible border of someone else's curated world. This is the Gilded Cage's most sophisticated trick. It makes you feel lucky. And luck makes people compliant. Hearst's guests were not prisoners in chains, they were prisoners in gratitude. Gratitude can be the most elegant form of control. Look at the dining settings. The long tables, the silver that gleams like quiet authority. The orchestration of courses, the choreography of service. Hear the yes, but becomes social rather than physical. Yes, you are dining in a palace, but every dinner is also a test. Can you keep up? Can you sparkle? Can you contribute to the atmosphere? Can you be interesting enough to justify your place at the table? In a world like this, boredom is the only unforgivable sin. So guests perform. They tell stories. They flirt. They laugh on cue. They become more vivid than they feel. Because the space demands vividness. And Hearst, at the center, watches with the calm satisfaction of a man who has engineered not only architecture but mood. He has built a machine that manufactures intimacy through spectacle. Yes, everyone is together. But togetherness in a palace can feel like being on display under soft light. There's nowhere to be ordinary without breaking the illusion. Even quiet becomes suspicious. Even fatigue becomes impolite. Walk into the grand interior rooms, the gathering rooms, the so-called living spaces, and you notice how the objects crowd the air. Paintings, sculptures, carvings, furniture chosen not just for comfort but for story. Everything here has provenance, as if the room must constantly prove its legitimacy by reminding you it has been touched by older hands. Older histories, yes, it is an education in European art, but it is also an insistence. Look, I have history. Look, I have roots. Look, I have tasted the old world and brought it home. The pressure is cumulative. Every artifact is another syllable in Hirst's self-definition. And when a room becomes a sentence about a person, the people inside become commas. They become punctuation. Their role is to support the meaning of the room, not to live freely within it. This is why such spaces can feel strangely dehumanizing. They are designed to elevate the owner's narrative, not the visitor's comfort. Yes, but yes, you are surrounded by culture, but the culture is being used like armor, and armor is not soft. Then there are the towers themselves, the visual signature, the silhouette that makes the castle unforgettable. Towers in architecture often symbolize watchfulness, control, distance. They allow you to see far. And seeing far has always been a metaphor for power. Yes, the view is intoxicating, Pacific stretching like a dark promise, coastline unrolling into haze. But a view this vast also makes the human inside it feel small. That is the other side of grandeur. It diminishes you even as it flatters you. To stand on a terrace above the world is to feel powerful. Yes, but it is also to feel separated. The wind is sharper up here. The air is thinner. The distance is emotional as well as physical. You can look down at everything and feel, for a second, untouchable. But untouchable is a lonely word. Untouchable means no one can hurt you. Yes, but it also means no one can hold you. Hearst built a place that makes untouchability feel glamorous. That is the cage, not Bar's altitude. Now consider the logistics behind the glamour, the staff required to maintain it, the kitchens that must feed crowds, the laundries that must clean endless linens, the gardeners shaping hedges and lawns into obedience, the technicians keeping water systems and lights and repairs running. The castle is a small city disguised as a fantasy. Yes, it looks effortless, but effort is everywhere. Hidden in back corridors, in service doors, in invisible labor that must be constant because the illusion is fragile. This is the economic truth of gilded cages. They are hungry. They consume money, time, human backs, human patience. They require a kind of devotion that is never photographed. And that devotion is not always gentle. People who work in such places often become part of the architecture, present but unseen, essential but uncredited. Yes, the host appears like a king, but kings are held up by countless hands that do not get to sit at the table. That is another crack embedded in the beauty, inequality made graceful. Now imagine a weekend at its peak. Celebrities arrive, their laughter like a kind of currency. Politicians arrive, measuring the room, measuring the host. Artists arrive, torn between awe and cynicism. Everyone arrives with an awareness that this is not merely a party, it is a scene in a larger story. Hearst, master of narratives, understands the power of scenes. He knows that what matters is not just the event, but the memory of the event, the myth of the event. So the castle functions like a camera. It frames people. It lights them. It gives them back to themselves as more glamorous versions. Yes, guests feel special here. But that specialness is engineered, and engineering implies intention. Intention implies manipulation. The place is a pleasure factory, but factories have outputs. The output here is devotion, loyalty, fascination. The castle makes you feel part of Hearst's world, and once you feel that, you are less likely to leave. less likely to criticize, less likely to look away. That is the psychological luxury, hidden under the decorative luxury, the feeling of belonging, offered like champagne and just as intoxicating. Yet the yes, but grows heavier as you stay. Yes, the parties are dazzling, but parties end. And after the last guest has gone to bed, after the laughter has thinned into distant murmurs, the castle becomes something else, a vast organism settling into quiet. Corridors echo. The wind moves through terraces with a sound like someone exhaling. The ocean below continues, indifferent. In that quiet, the castle's scale can begin to feel like emptiness. Rooms that were built for crowds feel too large for one person's mood. Artifacts feel less like trophies and more like witnesses. And the host, if he is alone with his own thoughts, may feel the underlying truth of his own creation. Yes, he has built a world, but the world cannot love him back. Stone cannot reassure. Water cannot promise devotion. Towers cannot hold you when the night turns heavy and the mind starts asking questions. It cannot edit. This is where the gilded cage does its most subtle work. It distracts in daylight. It intimidates in afternoon. And at night, it reveals its cold core. A palace is an external solution to an internal problem. The solution looks magnificent. The problem remains. Hearst's castle is a masterpiece of sensory excess, and it is impossible not to be seduced by it. But seduction is not the same as comfort. Seduction is a hook. Comfort is a home. Hearst built a hook. He built a place that makes people gasp. A place that makes them feel lucky. A place that makes the world climb toward him. Yes, it is paradise. But paradise designed to impress is always slightly anxious, because it must keep impressing. The castle does not let you forget the presence of an audience, even when the audience is only imagined. And imagined audiences are sometimes the harshest of all. So as we move toward the crack, the moment when the machine of spectacle begins to falter, hold this in your mind. The castle is not just a set of rooms. It is a psychological environment. Its luxury is real, but its luxury is also a kind of discipline. It teaches you how to behave. It teaches you what to value. It teaches you that being watched is glamorous. And once you have been taught that, being unwatched can feel like death. The first sign that a world is ending is not collapse. It is fatigue. Not the dramatic fatigue of a fainting spell in a ballroom, but the quieter fatigue that gathers behind the eyes, the kind that makes even applause feel heavy. Hearst Castle was built to host spectacle, to keep the lights on in the mind, to ensure that the host remained the center of orbit. But orbits depend on energy, and energy is a human currency that runs out no matter how rich you are. The crack begins, as it always does in stories of gilded excess, with the owner's body remembering that it is not a corporation, it is not a headline, it is not a fortress, it is flesh, and flesh eventually refuses to keep pace with myth. At first, the castle still looks the same from the outside. The towers still hold their posture. The Pacific still glitters like a backdrop. But inside the routine, small adjustments appear. A weekend that is shorter than usual, a guest list that is less ambitious, a dinner that ends earlier, an apology offered in a tone that tries to sound casual but carries a faint, unfamiliar humility. I'm tired. In a place built on being extraordinary, tiredness is the first scandal, because tiredness suggests the host is human. And the entire architecture of the castle was designed to make human limitations feel irrelevant. The crack widens with time, because time is not impressed by parties. The Great Depression arrives like a cold wind through even the most expensive corridors. Markets tighten, public mood hardens, extravagance begins to look obscene rather than glamorous. The cultural weather changes, and suddenly the very thing Hearst built his myth upon, spectacle, becomes less a triumph and more a target. In lean years, people resent reminders of excess. In lean years, castles on hills look like insults. Hearst, a master of reading and shaping public sentiment, cannot help but feel the shift. He has built his life on attention. But attention is not always affectionate. It can turn, it can sharpen, it can become a blade. The castle that once functioned like a magnet now risks functioning like a lightning rod. That is one of the cruelest reversals for a man of influence. The realization that the narrative has changed and he cannot fully control it anymore. Meanwhile, the costs of maintaining the dream do not politely adjust to the mood of the nation. The castle remains what it always was, a living, breathing machine that consumes. Staff must be paid. Systems must be maintained. Water must be managed. Repairs must be constant. Because salt air is patient and relentless. Gardens must be kept in their disciplined beauty. Because the moment nature misbehaves, the illusion weakens. And illusions are expensive precisely because they are fragile. Yes, Hearst had immense wealth, but wealth is not an abstract number in a story. It is liquid and fixed and invested and subject to tides. When economic winds shift, even giants feel it. The crack becomes practical. Budgets tighten, plans slow. Projects that were once inevitable become later. And later, in the language of unfinished dreams, is often a disguised goodbye. The castle, that sprawling organism, begins to show signs of incompletion that it once would not have tolerated. Some areas remain perpetually under construction. Some grand expansions are postponed, perhaps forever. And here is the psychological wound. Hearst did not build this place to be good enough. He built it to be definitive. In his mind, unfinished is not a neutral word. Unfinished is failure. Unfinished is weakness made visible. The more the castle remains incomplete, the more it exposes the truth he tried to outrun. Even the most powerful man cannot always finish what he starts. Because finishing requires not only money, but time. And time is the one resource no empire truly owns. Then comes the deeper crack, the shift in social gravity. The glittering guests who once climbed the hill for the thrill of being near Hearst begin to have other options, other obligations, other anxieties. Hollywood changes, politics changes, the warriors loom and then arrive, reorganizing priorities, turning luxury into something faintly shameful. At least publicly, the idea of spending weekends at a mountaintop palace begins to clash with the national mood. Even if people still want it privately, they may not want to be seen wanting it. Social life is not only about pleasure, it is about permission. And permission is a public phenomenon. When society no longer grants permission to indulge, indulgence becomes risky. Hearst feels that risk. He has always loved the spotlight. But now the spotlight's color temperature is colder. He is older. The culture is harsher. The castle's magic begins to thin. And thinning magic is terrifying to someone who built his identity on being extraordinary. The parties, once effortless in their momentum, begin to feel like work to maintain relevance, work to keep people interested, work to keep the hill from becoming merely a hill with an expensive building on it, work, most of all, to keep the host from becoming a relic while still alive. And age does what age always does. It reduces your tolerance for work. Your nerves become less patient. Your body recovers slower. Your desire for constant performance softens into a desire for quiet you do not know how to admit you want. Hearst's circle narrows, not necessarily because he loses power, but because power no longer delivers the same pleasure. The castle, once a fantasy, begins to feel like a responsibility. Its vastness, once thrilling, becomes logistical. Rooms feel larger in a way that is not glamorous but exhausting. Corridors stretch longer. Stairs demand more. A place designed for crowds begins to feel like too much space for one aging man's mind. This is where the castle turns, subtly, from a stage into a mirror. And the reflection it offers is not always kind. It reflects not only wealth, but loneliness. A mountaintop is a beautiful place to host others. It is a brutal place to be alone. The wind up there has a different voice at night. The fog arrives without asking. The ocean below is magnificent. Yes, but it is also indifferent, which is a word that becomes heavier as you age. In youth, indifference feels like a challenge. In old age, it can feel like a verdict. Now imagine Hearst in his later years. The parties fewer, the energy lower, his body more easily tired. Imagine him walking through rooms stuffed with artifacts of older empires. At first, those artifacts were trophies, proof of taste, proof of legitimacy. Now they might feel like reminders. Those empires fell too. Their kings died. Their castles became museums. History does not preserve the feeling of power. It preserves only the object. The object remains. The man diminishes. That is the most humiliating lesson architecture can teach its owner. The castle begins to feel like it will outlive him, not as an extension of his greatness, but as a witness to his disappearance. And disappearance is what Hearst feared most, not financial loss, not even criticism, but the world's slow turning away. Then the fall approaches in the form it always takes, a cluster of forces, converging. Health declines. The cultural moment shifts. Finances tighten. The political world becomes more complex. The private relationships that once served as comfort become strained by the weight of years, by the pressure of public life, by the exhaustion of maintaining a myth. Perhaps the people closest to him begin to encourage practicality, fewer guests, fewer expansions, less strain. Practicality is another word for surrender. Surrender is difficult for men who built mountains into ornaments. Yet the body forces a kind of surrender anyway. The fall is not a single event, it is a gradual retreat. Hearst spends less time on the hill. He visits and then leaves. He leaves and returns less. The castle stands waiting, an enormous instrument without its musician. Staff still maintain it, because the machine must run whether the owner is present or not. But the atmosphere changes. A palace without its host feels different. It is like a theater after the star has exited. The lights still work. The seats are still there, but the air has lost its voltage. The myth begins to evaporate. And then comes the final turning point, one of those moments that in hindsight feels inevitable, yet in the moment must have felt like betrayal. The decision that the castle cannot remain purely private. The world of private hilltop kingdoms is fading, and maintaining one becomes less an expression of power and more a sign of stubbornness against reality. Hearst, the man who once used narratives to control perception, now finds himself inside a narrative he cannot fully shape, the story of decline. The story of excess becoming unsustainable. The story of a titan becoming an old man. It is not an unkind story, necessarily, but it is a story that strips away the godlike aura he cultivated. It reveals the human underneath. And the human, however brilliant, is mortal. That mortality is the fall. There is something particularly haunting about a castle built as an answer to fear, becoming the place where fear is confirmed. A hilltop palace cannot stop your heart from aging. Towers cannot negotiate with illness. Artifacts cannot hug you. Pools cannot promise that the people who laughed at your table will still be there when you are quiet. The castle's beauty, which once functioned like armor, becomes at the end a kind of weight. It is difficult to be small inside something that enormous. It is difficult to be tired inside a world that demands sparkle. It is difficult to confront death in rooms designed to pretend death does not exist. And so the machine slows, the glittering weekends become fewer, the castle becomes more silent, the silence spreads through corridors like fog. The fall completes itself, not with an explosion, but with a relinquishment, the host no longer at the center. The palace no longer primarily a stage for living myth, but a structure waiting to become history. And then, eventually, he dies not on the hill, not in the towers, not framed by the Pacific like a cinematic ending, but elsewhere, away from the physical symbol of his obsession. That detail is the story's final sting. The man who tried to anchor his legacy in stone did not end his life inside that anchor. He ended, as humans often do, in the practical realm of care. Decline, ordinary necessity. The castle remains, but it is no longer a weapon of relevance. It is a relic with a pulse of old glamour still inside it, like perfume trapped in fabric long after the wearer is gone. The fall has happened. Now we arrive at the echo. The question becomes, what does this place mean when the man who needed it is gone? What does a castle do when it can no longer feed an ego? Does it become art? Does it become warning? Does it become comfort for strangers who come to stare at the ruins of someone else's appetite? The answer lies in what the castle becomes next: a public site, a preserved spectacle, a museum of longing. And that transformation is both salvation and humiliation. Salvation because the building survives, humiliation because it survives without the intimacy of ownership. The hilltop palace, designed to make the world climb toward one man, now invites the world to climb for its own curiosity. The center of gravity shifts from person to place. Hearst built it to say, "Look at me." The future looks and says, "Look at this." And in that tiny grammatical "change me to this" lies the entire tragedy of the fall. Today, the hill still rises above the Pacific with the same indifferent grandeur, and the castle still sits on its crest like a sentence carved into stone. But the subject of that sentence has changed. It is no longer a private world arranged around one man's appetite. It is a public experience, packaged and preserved, where strangers climb not to pay homage to Hearst the Titan, but to satisfy a quieter impulse, the human fascination with other people's excess. The road up is no longer a pilgrim's path to power. It is a route on a tour schedule. The gates do not swing open for a guest list. They admit ticket holders. And the air inside the estate carries a different kind of electricity, not the anxious voltage of needing to impress, but the curious hum of spectatorship. The castle has become a museum of longing. And like all museums, it offers two stories at once: the story of beauty and the story of what beauty was used to conceal. Visitors arrive with cameras and comfortable shoes, and immediately you feel the great reversal that time performs with such casual cruelty. Rooms that were designed to intimidate now entertain. Corridors that once separated classes now guide crowds. The Neptune pool, once a private stage for glamour, now exists as an icon, photographed, admired, consumed as an image that can fit in a palm-sized screen. The Roman pool, once a jewel box of controlled luxury, now gleams under the gaze of people who will never swim there. People who stare at it the way they stare at a painting, with the safety of distance, and in that safety is the first echo. The castle is still stunning, but its power has shifted from dominance to spectacle. It no longer controls the world. It merely invites the world to look. Hearst wanted to be unavoidable. Ironically, the place has achieved that on its own terms. Even people who do not care about his newspapers, his scandals, his influence, still care about the castle. The building has outlived the man's specific battles and turned them into aesthetic trivia. This is one of history's most consistent jokes. It preserves the prop and forgets the performer. Hearst Castle is now famous in a way that is almost detached from Hearst's inner hunger. People come because the place is beautiful, because the view is breathtaking, because the pools look like gods might have used them, because the towers cut the sky in a shape that feels cinematic. They come for the experience of seeing how far wealth can stretch imagination. They come for the thrill of proximity to excess without paying its cost. And that is the second echo. The public gets to consume the fantasy without being trapped inside it. They can enjoy the luxury without inheriting the obligation to maintain it. They can take the photograph and leave. They can taste the spectacle and remain free. The gilded cage has become a theme the world can sample. And sampling is safer than living. Walk through the interiors now and you can almost feel the ghost of the original intention hovering behind the interpretive plaques and guided explanations. You see the artifacts, the imported ceilings, the tapestries, the objects that were once arranged to prove legitimacy. Now they are arranged to illustrate a point in history. The same objects that once functioned as armor now function as educational exhibits. That transformation is not just practical, it is philosophical. It reveals how quickly power turns into context. In Hearst's time, the castle was a living instrument of influence, a place where proximity to the host might mean access, deals, an invisible social advantage. Today, proximity to the place means nothing beyond experience. It is a beautiful body with no political heartbeat. This is the third echo. Even the most strategic luxury becomes eventually decorative. The castle is not an active empire anymore, it is a fossil of empire. And fossils are strangely democratic. They belong to whoever can look at them. That is the deep irony of public heritage. The very structures built to separate become, in the end, shared. Hearst built altitude to separate himself from the ordinary. Time turned his altitude into a lookout point for the ordinary. The public now ascends to witness not his dominance, but his desire. That shift is subtle, but it is everything. The castle, once meant to say, I am above you, now says, I was above you, and look what that cost. It offers an aftertaste, not only of envy, but of relief. Relief that most people do not have to live inside their own performance at that scale. Relief that they can go home to smaller rooms where voices do not need to be announced. Relief that their lives are not museums waiting to happen. Yet the echo is not purely moralistic. The castle is not only a warning, it is also a testament to human ability. The craftsmanship is real. The artistry is real. The ambition is real. To build such a thing is to prove that imagination, when funded and obsessed over, can become geography. There is something awe-inspiring about that, even if the motive behind it is complicated. The castle is a reminder that human beings can manifest dreams in stone. But it is also a reminder that dreams built to impress others often become burdens to the dreamer. So the philosophical question returns, sharpened by the museum context. When you stand there, surrounded by imported beauty and mythic pools, what are you really looking at? Are you looking at success? Or are you looking at insecurity rendered in marble? Are you looking at art? Or are you looking at hunger disguised as taste? Are you looking at legacy? Or are you looking at a monument to the fear of being forgotten? The answer, like all honest answers, is probably yes to all. The echo is layered because the human mind is layered. Hearst Castle is not a single message. It is a choir of messages arguing with each other. One voice says, "This is glorious." Another voice says, "This is excessive." Another voice says, "This is brilliant." Another voice says, "This is desperate." And the most haunting voice, the one you might hear only if you linger long enough for the tour group to move ahead, says, "This is lonely." Because in the quiet corners, in the places where the crowd noise fades, the castle's scale becomes intimate in a strange way. Not intimate like a small home, but intimate like a confession written too large to ignore. A mountaintop palace, when stripped of parties, reveals its true nature. It is a private wish shouted into the wind. Hearst's wish was not simply to own beauty. It was to be the kind of person beauty would orbit. It was to make himself the center of a world that could not stop paying attention. And in that wish, you can hear a human vulnerability that survives the era. The fear that, without applause, you might disappear. The museum does not say this explicitly, because museums are polite, but the building says it anyway. If you let it, every tower says it. Every terrace says it. Every artifact says it. They say, "I was trying to make myself permanent." And permanence, as the ocean below never stops demonstrating, belongs to no one. The Pacific keeps breathing. Fog keeps rolling in. Salt keeps eating stone grain by grain. The castle stands, but it stands in a relationship with decay, not with immortality. That is the final, natural echo. Architecture can resist time, but it cannot defeat it. It can slow forgetting, but it cannot prevent the world from changing what it remembers you for. Hearst thought the castle would secure his myth. Instead, it has become an exhibit about excess, about American ambition, about the strange marriage between media power and personal longing. His name remains attached, yes, but attached in a way he might not have fully desired, less as the man who ruled and more as the man who needed. That is the echo's sharpest edge, because need is human, and humans are not always comfortable admitting need, especially men who built empires by pretending they did not need anything at all. So the castle's aftertaste is complicated. It leaves you with admiration for the vision and unease about the motive. It leaves you with pleasure in the beauty and sadness at the hunger that beauty tried to feed. It leaves you with a question that is not about Hearst alone, but about any life built around spectacle. If you spend your existence trying to be unforgettable, what part of you is being neglected while you build the monument? What tenderness is being postponed? What quiet joy is being sacrificed to keep the performance bright? The castle does not answer. It cannot. It is stone. But it offers you an opportunity to feel the seduction of grandeur and still recognize the trap. To stand in front of the Neptune pool and think, yes, it is paradise. But paradise is not the same as peace. To look at the towers and think, yes, they are magnificent, but magnificence is not the same as love. And then, perhaps, to leave the hill with a softer kind of wealth, the knowledge that being seen is not the same as being held. That is the echo Hearst Castle gives the modern world. It does not merely show you what a man could build. It shows you what a man was trying to repair inside himself by building. And the ocean below, ancient, tireless, unimpressed, keeps breathing, as if to underline the moral with the simplest rhythm of all. Everything ends. But not everything matters. So choose carefully what you build your life around, because the things that remain after you are gone may not tell the story you intended. At dawn, when the sky above the Yamuna River is still undecided between night and day, a white shape begins to emerge from the mist, like a memory refusing to fade. It looks weightless at first, more vapor than stone, and architecture so pale it seems to have been carved out of morning itself. 4 minarets stand like quiet guardians. A great dome rises with the calm confidence of something that expects eternity. And as the sun climbs, the marble changes color, shifting from cool silver to warm rose, as if the building is blushing at being watched. For centuries, people have called it the most beautiful monument to love ever built. They have described it as poetry in stone, a hymn made physical, a palace of grief that somehow became the world's favorite romantic symbol. It is the kind of beauty that makes strangers speak softly without being told, the kind of symmetry that makes the human mind feel briefly reassured that order exists. And yet the paradox at the heart of the Taj Mahal is not hidden. It is carved into its very purpose. This is a masterpiece built out of loss. It is not a home. It is not a palace of living joy. It is a tomb. How did death become the world's most famous love story? How did mourning become a tourist dream? How did a place designed to hold a body become a place that holds the imagination of millions? The first time you see the Taj, the mind wants to simplify it, to file it under romance, to wrap it in the soft narrative people prefer. An emperor loved his wife so much he built this for her. End of story. But monuments like this are never that simple. Because love at imperial scale is never only love. Love inside power is braided with politics, with theology, with ego, with legacy. When an emperor builds a tomb so spectacular that it becomes one of the world's defining images, he is not merely grieving, he is also speaking to history. He is saying, my love deserves to be permanent. My sorrow deserves to be witnessed. My dynasty deserves to be remembered through beauty rather than through blood. The Taj Mahal is an act of devotion, yes, but it is also an act of authorship, a ruler writing his version of eternity across the skyline. And here is the paradox hook, sharpened into its most unsettling form. The Taj looks like serenity, yet it was born from devastation. It looks like peace, yet it required immense labor, immense wealth, immense control, an empire's worth of resources marshaled to produce a single, perfect symbol. What does it mean when love becomes an imperial project? What does it cost to make grief beautiful? And if the building is meant to honor a woman, why does the monument also feel like it is crowning the man who built it? A step closer and the perfection becomes almost suspicious. The gardens are laid out with mathematical discipline. Channels of water reflecting the dome as if the earth itself is rehearsing admiration. The entrance gate frames the mausoleum like a camera frames a star. Every approach is engineered to create wonder on cue. The Taj does not simply exist, it performs. It leads you forward as if guiding your emotions. First anticipation, then revelation, then reverence. You can feel how carefully this experience was designed, and that design introduces a colder thought beneath the romance. Monuments do not just express feeling, they manufacture it. The Taj Mahal manufactures awe, and awe is a form of power. Even now, centuries later, it controls the body, how people walk, where they pause, what angle they photograph, when they gasp. It is a tomb that acts like a crown, and that is the paradox. It is the purest symbol of love and the purest symbol of authority, fused so seamlessly that the world forgets to ask which one came first. The river beside it flows the way time flows, indifferent and continuous. The marble stands as if refusing that flow. Yet marble, too, is vulnerable to weather, to pollution, to the slow staining of reality. Even a monument built to feel eternal must fight the world to remain white. That fight is another hidden contradiction. Love is remembered here as purity. But purity requires constant maintenance. The image of perfect white marble is not natural, it is preserved. And preserved things are always, in some way, fragile. So the Taj offers us a dazzling surface and a deeper question. Is this monument primarily a gift to the dead, or a message to the living? Is it a sanctuary for one woman's memory, or a stage for one man's legacy? When the world stands before it and says, "This is love," is it seeing love, or is it seeing the empire's ability to aestheticize grief into something that serves power? That is where we begin, not with dates, not with dynasties, but with the contradiction that makes the Taj shimmer with an almost unbearable intensity. The most romantic building on earth is also, fundamentally, a grave. And graves do not exist for the living's happiness. They exist as reminders. So what exactly is the Taj Mahal reminding us of, love or mortality? Shah Jahan's obsession did not begin as architecture. It began as a private rupture so profound that an empire could not distract him from it. When the woman at the center of his life died, his favorite, his companion, the one whose presence had become a kind of gravity, he was not merely bereaved in the way ordinary people are bereaved. An emperor's grief is a dangerous substance. It is not confined to bedrooms and quiet corners. It has access to treasuries, armies, artisans, laws. It can marshal thousands of hands to build a metaphor large enough to contain what the heart cannot, and that is precisely what happened. The story is often told as pure romance. A husband loved his wife so much, he built a wonder for her. But to understand the Taj Mahal as a human document rather than a postcard, you must look at the psychology of the builder. Because Shah Jahan did not only mourn, he tried to negotiate with death. He tried to turn loss into permanence. He tried to make the universe retract its cruelty through the only language an emperor truly trusts: command. An obsessed ruler in grief does not ask, "How do I survive this?" he asks, "How do I transform this into something history cannot ignore?" The first strand of the obsession is devotion. Yes, but devotion sharpened by trauma. When someone dies, the living are left with an unbearable asymmetry. You remember. They cannot. You speak. They are silent. You exist. They do not. Grief is, at its core, a refusal to accept that asymmetry. It is the mind insisting that love should have leverage. That if love was real enough, it should be able to stop the ending. But love does not stop endings. So the mind looks for substitutes, rituals, relics, photographs, places. Shah Jahan, with an empire behind him, looked for the most dramatic substitute possible, a structure that would keep his wife present through beauty. If he could not keep her alive, he would keep her visible. And visibility, to a man accustomed to controlling what is seen, feels like a kind of victory. The second strand is power. And this is where the story becomes colder. The Mughal court was not a private household. It was a stage where legitimacy was constantly reinforced. Kings did not simply rule, they performed divine favor. Sophistication, stability. Death inside such a court is never only personal. It is political. When an emperor is shaken, the court watches, rivals watch. The empire watches. In that gaze, grief becomes risky. Vulnerability invites ambition in others. So an emperor must convert grief into strength, must transmute sorrow into something that looks like authority rather than fragility. The Taj Mahal is grief converted into command. It says, even in loss, I can build perfection. Even in devastation, I can create order so flawless it seems ordained. Even when death touches me, my response will be a masterpiece, not a collapse. This is why the monument is not only a tomb. It is a statement about imperial resilience. It is an answer to the question every empire secretly fears. What happens when the ruler breaks? Shah Jahan's answer was architecture. He built instead of falling apart, or rather, he built to avoid falling apart. The third strand is ego, but not the cheap caricature of ego. It is the subtler ego of a ruler who believes his feelings matter on a cosmic scale. Ordinary people grieve privately because they must. An emperor may grieve publicly because he can, because public grief becomes an extension of his myth. If the world must remember his dynasty, why not ensure the world remembers his love? If history will tell stories anyway, why not give history a story so beautiful it becomes inevitable? This is the obsession with authorship, to control the narrative of your own sorrow. The Taj does not leave grief to rumor. It choreographs grief into marble. It edits pain into symmetry. It turns a messy human wound into a clean, photogenic legend. That alone should make you uneasy. Because symmetry is not how grief feels. Grief is uneven, jagged, repetitive, irrational. The Taj's perfection is a psychological counterspell. It is the builder insisting that what is chaotic inside can be made orderly outside. The fourth strand is immortality, the oldest obsession of rulers. Shah Jahan lived in a world where kings were compared to suns, where dynasties thought in centuries, where monuments were not decoration but strategy. A monument outlives gossip. A monument outlives rebellion. A monument outlives the fragile softness of human memory. If you want to be remembered, you build what cannot be easily erased. The Taj is, in that sense, an immortality machine. It immortalizes the wife, yes, but it also immortalizes the husband's capacity to love, which is a more cunning form of immortality because it casts the ruler as human in the most flattering way. Power is often resented. Love is adored. If Shah Jahan could attach his name to love itself, then history might forgive the harsher parts of empire. This is where devotion and legacy intertwine. The monument becomes propaganda for tenderness. A ruler saying, I am not only a conqueror, I am a lover. Remember me that way. But obsession always has a shadow. And the shadow here is control. To build the Taj required controlling an enormous workforce, controlling resources, controlling aesthetics, controlling time. It demanded that thousands of lives bend around one man's grief. This is the uncomfortable truth the romance narrative often hides. The beauty of the Taj is inseparable from the machinery of empire. Laborers worked, artisans carved, stone was transported, wealth was extracted, decisions were enforced. All of it so that one emotion could be turned into stone. That does not negate the love, but it complicates it, because when love becomes an imperial project, it stops being purely private. It becomes performance. It becomes conquest of meaning. It becomes a way of bending the world to match the shape of your longing. Shah Jahan's obsession was to make his loss unignorable. He wanted grief to be visible the way wealth is visible, the way power is visible. He wanted sorrow to have architecture, and architecture, once built, forces everyone else to participate. Every visitor, every admirer, every future generation becomes a witness. That is part of the obsession, to ensure you are not alone in your pain, to make the world carry it with you, even if the world did not consent. Imagine the emperor in the aftermath of death, pacing through rooms that suddenly feel too large, too quiet, too indifferent. Imagine him looking at the river and feeling how time moves forward without asking permission. He cannot accept that. He is an emperor. He does not accept, so he chooses a location, a riverbank that will become sacred ground, because the river symbolizes continuity, and he needs continuity now more than ever. He chooses white marble, not only because it is beautiful, but because it suggests purity, transcendence, something untouched by the dirtiness of decay. He chooses symmetry, not only because it pleases the eye, but because it functions like a psychological sedative. Symmetry tells the mind that balance exists, that the universe can be made orderly, that chaos can be disciplined. He chooses a garden layout that hints at paradise, because paradise is the ultimate comfort narrative in a religious world. The idea that death is not an ending but a relocation. The Taj becomes not just a tomb, but a map toward a theological reassurance. She is not gone. She is in a better place. And this place on earth will mirror that better place as faithfully as stone can. Yes, it is devotion, but devotion designed as an argument against despair. And then obsession, as always, begins to demand more. More refinement, more perfection, more impossible details. A carved flower that looks too delicate to be stone, inlaid gemstones that catch light as if grief itself has been turned into sparkle, calligraphy that wraps scripture around the walls like a protective spell. Every detail says, we will not let death have the last aesthetic word. If death must win biologically, we will win symbolically. This is the bargain Shah Jahan tries to strike. He cannot resurrect the dead, but he can resurrect the feeling of her presence through beauty, so overwhelming it convinces the mind she is still near. Beauty becomes a stand-in for touch. Marble becomes a stand-in for skin. Reflection in water becomes a stand-in for memory. The entire complex becomes a machine designed to generate the illusion that love can outlast the body. Yet here is the cruelest psychological twist. A monument of this scale does not soothe grief. It can also preserve it. In ordinary life, grief slowly changes shape. It dulls. It becomes integrated. It becomes less acute. But when you build a tomb that demands constant attention, you create a permanent reminder. You make your loss visible every day. You lock yourself into the story. You trap yourself in the moment of devastation and then surround that moment with perfection, so it cannot age naturally. The Taj is grief made eternal. And eternity is not always kind to the living. The obsession, then, is double-edged. It is a tribute to love, and it is a refusal to let the wound heal. Shah Jahan's mind, like many minds in grief, might have believed that healing would be betrayal. If the pain lessens, does it mean the love was less? If the sorrow fades, does it mean she is fading? The monument solves that fear by ensuring she cannot fade. But it also ensures the emperor cannot move on. Not truly. He becomes the caretaker of his own myth of mourning. He has built a place where his grief is always on display. Always pure, always dramatic, always beautiful. And beautiful grief is seductive, because it feels meaningful. It feels like love made visible, but it is also heavy, because it demands you keep feeling. It demands you keep returning. It demands you keep being the man who lost. That is the obsession's trap. And because he is an emperor, the trap is enormous. He cannot simply disappear into private sadness. He cannot simply become a widower with a quiet life. His grief is a public phenomenon, and the Taj turns it into the public phenomenon that will outlive him. So the obsession is complete, devotion braided with power, sorrow braided with legacy, tenderness braided with control. The Taj Mahal is the outcome. Now we step into the gilded cage itself, the visual paradise that carries, underneath its white glow, the chill of death and the pressure of perfection. Because yes, it is the most beautiful love story in stone. But what does it feel like to live inside a love story that is also a tomb? Approaching the Taj Mahal is like approaching an idea that has been rehearsed for centuries. Even before you see the marble clearly, you feel the choreography. There is a gate, monumental and deliberate, framing the mausoleum in a way that makes the building appear as a revelation rather than a structure. You walk, and the garden guides you like a sentence guides a reader, straight lines, mirrored channels. Symmetry so disciplined it feels almost moral. Water runs in thin, controlled paths, reflecting the dome as if the earth is practicing reverence. The air is often warm, carrying the scent of dust and greenery, but the visual temperature is cool white marble ahead. Pristine as a myth. Yes, it is breathtaking. But notice how the experience is engineered. The Taj does not let you stumble into wonder accidentally. It conducts you. It scripts your awe. And in that scripting is the first hint of the gilded cage. This is not a place that invites your own interpretation. It insists on a particular feeling. It insists on purity. It insists on reverence. Step closer, and the marble becomes less like a dream and more like a surface smooth, luminous, almost too clean. It catches light in a way that makes the building seem to glow from within. And the glow is intoxicating. But marble also has a personality. It is elegant and unforgiving. It does not absorb warmth. It reflects it away. Even in the heat of India, you can feel the coolness in its presence. Yes, it looks soft from a distance, but up close it behaves like ice dressed in sunlight. The Taj is famous for its whiteness, and whiteness reads as innocence, as transcendence, as romance. Yet whiteness at this scale is also a demand. It demands maintenance. It demands protection. It demands that the world not touch it too much, not stain it, not breathe on it too heavily. Purity, once you try to preserve it, becomes anxious. And the Taj's perfection carries that anxiety like a second skin. The surfaces are too controlled to feel casual. There is no room here for the mess of living. This is not the kind of beauty that welcomes fingerprints. It is the kind of beauty that shames them. And that is the yes. But, again, yes, it is pure. But purity can feel sterile. Purity can feel like a rule rather than a comfort. Look at the inlay work, flowers, formed not with paint but with stone, set into stone. Delicate petals made from semi-precious materials. Vines curling with such finesse that the mind struggles to accept they are not drawn with ink. It is craftsmanship that borders on supernatural, the kind that makes you want to lean closer, to stare, to let your eyes drink every detail. Yes, it is astonishing, but it also carries a strange coldness. These flowers will never wilt. They will never smell. They will never grow unpredictably. They are nature frozen into obedience, a garden that cannot die. And because it cannot die, it cannot truly live. That is the psychological undertone. The Taj is full of lifelike beauty that has been petrified. It is a monument to a woman, but the beauty offered is beauty without breath. The inlaid flowers are eternal. Yes, but eternity is a kind of death too, a refusal of change. When you realize that the romance begins to sharpen, you are not looking at blossoms. You are looking at a desire to stop time. The Taj is time arrested, grief polished into symmetry, love fossilized into ornament. Now lift your gaze to the calligraphy, the Quranic verses that frame entrances and wrap around arches. The script is elegant, black against white, a visual contrast that feels both decorative and protective. The text, sacred, functions like a veil and a warning. Yes, it adds spiritual depth, but it also reminds you that this is not a neutral love story. It is love inside theology. It is death inside faith. It is an argument about paradise, about the afterlife, about cosmic order. The Taj does not merely say, I loved her. It says, the universe has a structure, and within that structure, My love has meaning. That kind of certainty is comforting. Yes. But certainty can also feel like pressure. If you frame grief as a sacred narrative, you must behave accordingly. You must mourn correctly. You must love correctly. You must believe correctly. The building itself becomes a sermon in marble. And sermons are not always gentle. They can soothe, yes, but they also instruct. They tell you what to feel. They tell you what to hope, and hope, when it is demanded, can become another cage. Then you reach the platform, the raised base that makes the mausoleum feel lifted from the earth, as if it refuses to be ordinary ground. This elevation is not only aesthetic, it is symbolic. The dead are placed above the living. The tomb becomes a throne. The building is literally set apart. Yes, it is magnificent, but the elevation also creates distance. The Taj is not just admired, it is separated. You do not enter it the way you enter a house. You approach it as you approach a holy object, with careful steps, with an awareness that your body is not the center here. The architecture makes you small, not through intimidation alone, but through sanctification. And sanctification is a subtle kind of power. It tells you that what is inside is beyond you. It tells you that your ordinary life is not the point. The point is the story being honored. And what story is that? A woman's death, a man's grief, a dynasty's claim to beauty. You step inside the mausoleum and the world becomes quieter. Not because it is peaceful, but because sound behaves differently here. The chamber is enclosed, and the marble walls and domed ceiling catch and return your voice with a soft echo. The echo is immediate, intimate, unavoidable. Yes, it creates a sacred hush, but it also makes you hyper-aware of yourself. A cough becomes a disruption. A footstep becomes an announcement. Even breathing feels louder. The space disciplines the body. It trains visitors into reverence through acoustics. The central cenotaph's symbolic tomb markers sit with solemn grandeur, ornamented, surrounded by a delicate screen. Yes, they are beautiful, but they are also performative. They are not the actual graves beneath. They are the public-facing version of death. Death curated for the eye. Death made elegant enough to be looked at. And that is perhaps the most unsettling, yes. But of all, yes, it honors the dead. But it also aestheticizes death in a way that makes it palatable for spectators. It turns loss into a display. It makes sorrow consumable. It makes grief photogenic. That is why the Taj can feel both holy and theatrical. It is a tomb that behaves like a stage. Move back outside and notice the gardens again. The classic charbagh layout with water channels dividing space into ordered quadrants, hinting at the Islamic vision of paradise as a garden beneath which rivers flow. Yes, the garden is serene, but serenity here is engineered. The trees are planted with intention. The paths are straight. The symmetry is so total it leaves little room for wildness. Even nature is recruited into the discipline of perfection. The garden offers a kind of calm, yes, but it is a calm that feels controlled, like calm in a court rather than calm in a meadow. And that control is not incidental. It reflects the builder's mind, a man trying to bring order to chaos, trying to impose pattern on pain. This is the Gilded Cage's emotional architecture. It gives you a visual paradise. But the paradise is built around a tomb. Every reflection in the water includes the dome, and the dome is the roof of death. The garden whispers paradise. But paradise here is always anchored to loss. You cannot walk through this beauty without being reminded of what it was built for. That reminder is gentle, yes, but relentless. Like a heartbeat you cannot stop hearing once you notice it. And the more perfect the place is, the more relentless the reminder becomes. because perfection does not allow distraction. In an imperfect building, cracks and stains can draw your attention away. Here, everything is too clean, too symmetrical, too refined. Your mind has nowhere to hide. It must face the central truth. This is grief made gorgeous. There is another layer of cage. 2. 1. The romance narrative rarely mentions the labor. The Taj's perfection is the result of thousands of lives arranged around one project. Artisans who spent years carving and inlaying, hands repeating motions until fingers became trained instruments. Workers transporting heavy stone, bodies sweating under the weight of imperial will, administrators organizing resources, enforcing timelines, ensuring the emperor's vision materialized. Yes, the Taj is a testament to love, but it is also a testament to empire's ability to mobilize human effort. That mobilization is awe-inspiring. Yes, but it raises the quiet moral discomfort. Love at this scale is not just feeling, it is authority. It is the ability to turn private longing into public labor. It is devotion with a payroll. It is grief with infrastructure. And infrastructure is never innocent. The Taj's beauty can make us forget the machinery behind it. That forgetting is part of how monuments work. They hide the cost under the surface sheen. But the cost is there, embedded like a fossil. The Taj is a gilded cage, not for its visitors, though it does guide their emotions, but for its creator. Because a monument this perfect becomes a permanent stage for mourning. It ensures the story will never be allowed to fade into ordinary memory, where grief softens and life continues. The Taj makes grief eternal. And eternity is a cruel demand for someone still alive. It demands that the emperor remain forever the grieving lover, forever the man of devotion, forever the author of this perfect sorrow. It offers him immortality. Yes, but immortality in a single role, and roles, no matter how flattering, can become prisons. That is the yes, but turned inward, yes. He immortalized love, but he also imprisoned himself in the narrative of loss. The building is so beautiful that it invites the world to romanticize grief, to treat mourning as a kind of aesthetic achievement. Yet grief is not an achievement, it is a wound. The Taj makes the wound glow, and glowing wounds are seductive to spectators, because they let us feel emotion without paying the full price of living it. We come, we admire, we take photos, we sigh, we say how romantic, and then we leave. The emperor could not leave. He lived inside the consequences. He lived inside the echo of his own devotion. The Taj may look like peace, but it is peace built around absence. It is calm built around emptiness. It is beauty built around death. And that combination, beauty plus death, creates a particular atmosphere that is hard to describe until you feel it. A sweetness with a chill, a romance with a shadow, a paradise that is also a reminder that paradise is, by definition, elsewhere. So when you stand there, with the marble glowing and the river nearby and the symmetry soothing your mind, you might feel uplifted. Yes. But if you listen closely to what the architecture is actually saying, you might also feel a quiet pressure. Remember that this is not a celebration of living love. This is a monument to love that had to survive without the beloved. And surviving without the beloved is not romance. It is endurance. Now we are ready for the crack and the fall, the moment when even an emperor's control over narrative breaks, when life refuses to stay inside the symmetry, when the builder discovers that you can create a paradise of stone and still be trapped in the mess of politics, family, time, because the Taj is not the end of the story. It is the most beautiful pause and pauses. in history are often followed by turning points that do not care about beauty. There is a particular cruelty in building something meant to last forever and then being forced to watch it from a distance. Not distance as in a polite walk across a garden, but distance as in exile, separation enforced by the very machinery of power you once commanded. Shah Jahan raised the Taj Mahal as if to pin grief to the earth so it could not drift away, as if to trap love in marble so time could not erode it into ordinary memory. But time does not negotiate, and politics, like time, has its own appetite. The crack begins not in the Taj's stone, but in the emperor's life, the shift from absolute command to fragile dependence, from the posture of ruler to the posture of captive. It is one of history's recurring ironies. The same power that enables a man to build a wonder also creates the conditions for his fall, because empires do not reward tenderness for long. They reward control, and control, sooner or later, provokes resistance. The story turns the way it often does in dynasties, quietly at first, in councils, in whispers, in the careful movement of factions. The emperor ages, his court recalculates, his heirs do what heirs often do. They begin to treat time as an opportunity. The line between filial duty and ambition blurs, because ambition always believes it is simply destiny arriving early. Shah Jahan, in his grief, may have been consumed by the monument, by the desire to perfect it, by the need to keep mourning visible and beautiful. Meanwhile, the empire still had to run. Armies still moved. Taxes still mattered. Alliances still required attention. And when a ruler's emotional focus becomes visibly anchored to a single project, the political world notices the vulnerability. It notices the possibility of leverage. The crack widens through family, because family inside empire is never only family. Sons are not merely sons. They are potential rulers. They are factions with bodies. They are futures with sharp teeth. The emperor's obsession, his need to make grief eternal, does not prevent the ordinary brutality of succession. If anything, it may soften his grip in ways others exploit. And then the decisive fracture arrives. Aurangzeb, his son, does what empires have trained men to do for centuries. He takes power. He takes it not by asking, but by asserting. The father who once commanded the world is suddenly, horrifyingly, commanded. This is the moment when the film, inside the documentary, changes its soundtrack. When the slow, lyrical beauty of the Taj becomes irrelevant to the hard percussion of political reality. The Palace of Mourning cannot protect the builder from politics. The marble does not rise up to defend him. Symmetry does not intervene. Love, even immortalized, cannot stop a coup. That is the fall's first truth. The monument may outlast time, but it does not outlast power shifts. Shah Jahan is not simply retired. He is confined. Imagine the shock of that confinement, not merely physical, but existential. A man who could order the construction of paradise is now reduced to asking permission to walk. A man whose word was law is now a living relic. And the most devastating detail, the one that makes the story ache, is the location of his confinement, Agrafort, close enough that he can see the Taj Mahal across the river, yet far enough that he cannot reach it. The Taj, his masterpiece of devotion, becomes his daily view, an eternal reminder, not only of the wife he lost, but of the life he lost too. This is the crack turning into a wound. He built the Taj to honor absence. Now his own life becomes defined by absence, absence of freedom, absence of authority, absence of the world he once shaped. The building that was meant to soothe becomes a mirror reflecting his defeat. The yes, but becomes merciless yes. He built the most beautiful tomb in the world, but he cannot enter it freely. Yes. He made grief eternal, but now his own suffering has become endless. Yes. He tried to defeat death with beauty, but he is forced to live a kind of death while still breathing. That is the emotional peak. Picture him by a window, older now, thinner, wrapped in the quiet humiliations that come with being watched, guarded, managed. The river glints, the dome glows, the minarets stand like patience. And he stands there, trapped, staring at the physical proof of what he once was capable of, staring at a monument that has become both comfort and torture. In such a view, even beauty can become cruel, because beauty promises access. Beauty suggests closeness. But when you cannot touch it, beauty becomes a taunt. It says, remember. It says, you did this, and yet you are powerless now. That is the fall's second truth. The things you build to give your life meaning can become, in decline, the sharpest reminders of what you no longer control. The crack also spreads outward, beyond the emperor's personal tragedy, into the empire itself. Grand monuments are often built at moments of peak confidence, when resources feel plentiful and authority feels unquestioned. But authority is never unquestioned for long. The Mughal Empire, despite its grandeur, faced pressures, internal rivalries, external threats, the constant strain of managing vast territories. The Taj is a jewel, but jewels are set into crowns, and crowns are heavy. The same state machinery that produced beauty also produced taxation, extraction, military campaigns. The empire's brilliance had costs, and those costs created resentments. Aurangzeb's reign would be marked by different priorities, harsher policies, wars that drained resources, a stricter posture toward religion and rule. The cultural atmosphere shifts. The court's taste changes. The empire's energy turns from building to fighting. The Taj remains luminous, but the world around it becomes more tense. This is another crack. When the political narrative changes, monuments become stranded in an earlier emotion. The Taj is a monument to love and paradise, but the empire moves into an era that does not foreground tenderness. So the Taj begins to exist like a beautiful ghost of a softer vision. It stands while politics hardens. It remains, but it no longer represents the dominant mood of the ruling power. That dissonance makes the monument even more haunting. It is the memory of an emperor's private longing, preserved inside a world that no longer shares that longing. And Shah Jahan, confined, watches that dissonance unfold from behind walls. The fall is not only the loss of power, it is the loss of context. The builder becomes an outsider to the very era he helped define. There is a particular heartbreak in imagining how he might have tried to interpret his own story during those years. Did he see it as betrayal? Surely. Did he see it as punishment? Perhaps. Did he see it as the universe's final insult, letting him build paradise and then denying him paradise? Almost certainly. And yet, if he was forced into stillness long enough, he might also have confronted a quieter realization that the Taj was never a solution. It was a translation. It translated grief into beauty, but it did not erase grief. It translated love into marble, but it did not resurrect the beloved. It translated a man's longing for permanence into symmetry, but it did not give him permanence. It gave him a view of what he wanted and what he could not keep. This is the fall's deepest lesson. You can build a monument that outlives you, but you cannot build your way out of being human. Even an emperor ends up looking out a window, measuring his life by what he can no longer reach. In the end, Shah Jahan's story becomes almost unbearably poetic in its cruelty. The man who created the world's most famous love monument spends his final years imprisoned, gazing at it like a lover separated by glass. He becomes a living ghost, haunting his own masterpiece. The crack has become complete. The dynasty continues, but the builder's gone from its center. The Taj remains, but the original love story is now only one layer of its meaning. The monument has survived the man. And survival changes what monuments are. They become less personal, more public. They become less a confession, more a symbol. They become less a private conversation with death, more a public object onto which millions project their own fantasies. That is the final fall. The monument escapes its creator. It becomes bigger than him. It becomes, in a sense, free of him, and freedom is always a loss for the one who wanted to control the narrative. Now we step into the echo, the final aftertaste. What does the Taj mean now, when the emperor is dust and the dynasty is history? But the marble still glows at sunrise? What does it mean when a tomb becomes the world's idea of romance? And what does it say about us, the living, that we keep turning death into postcards? Now, the Taj Mahal belongs. In the strange way monuments belong to everyone and no one. It is still there at dawn, still lifting itself out of the mist with that quiet theatricality that feels less like architecture and more like apparition. It still changes color as the sun moves cool. Warm, luminous like a living thing pretending to be stone. It still makes people instinctively hush. It still draws crowds who arrive with the same expression history has worn for centuries when it confronts beauty that seems too perfect to be real. Disbelief softened into reverence. But the Taj's meaning has shifted, because meaning always shifts when the original owner is gone. Shah Jahan built it as a private argument with mortality. Today, it is a public symbol, a global icon, photographed and repeated until its image has become almost detached from the ache that birthed it. People come for romance. They come for aesthetics. They come to stand in the exact spot where the building aligns perfectly in their camera frame so the dome sits like a pearl in the center of their screen. They come to say, I was here, and the sentence sounds harmless, even joyful. Yet the building itself remains what it always was, a tomb. That is the first echo, the one the world keeps trying to forget, and the marble keeps patiently reminding us of. The most romantic monument on earth is still a house for the dead. The second echo is stranger and sharper. The Taj has become a love story that does not belong to the lovers. It belongs to the spectators. Every year, millions of people project their own longing onto it. They arrive with their own relationships, their own hope, their own fear of loss. They look at the Taj and feel not Shah Jahan's grief, but their own desire for permanence. They want to believe that love can be made eternal, that devotion can leave behind something pure enough to survive time. The Taj gives them that fantasy. It offers proof, or at least the illusion of proof. That human feeling can become something that outlasts flesh. And because the building is so beautiful, the mind is willing to accept the illusion. Beauty has always been the most persuasive liar, but the river still flows beside it, indifferent, repeating the oldest truth. Everything passes. Even if the marble remains for centuries, the people do not. The Taj's romance is therefore not only romantic, it is a negotiation with fear. When people call it a monument to love, what they are often really saying is, please let love be stronger than death. The Taj does not answer, but it glows anyway, and the glow is enough to keep the hope alive. That is the third echo. The Taj functions as emotional medicine for strangers. It treats their anxiety with beauty. It offers them a story they can hold on to, even if the story is simplified. And simplification is another kind of preservation. We preserve what we can carry. We cannot carry an empire's complexity, so we carry a romance. We cannot carry the machinery of labor and taxation and court politics, so we carry a legend of devotion. The Taj becomes a distilled narrative: love, loss, beauty. 3 words the world can repeat without needing to confront what it cost. Yet the cost is the 4th echo, the one that whispers under the tourist chatter if you listen for it. The Taj was not built by love alone. It was built by empire, by resources gathered, by labor organized, by human lives shaped around one grand project. Monuments at this scale are never innocent. They are masterpieces. Yes, but they are also evidence of control. The Taj's perfection required an authority powerful enough to demand perfection. And that authority had consequences. The building is therefore both a hymn and a receipt. It shows what devotion can produce, and it shows what power can mobilize. When we admire the Taj, we are admiring not only beauty but capacity, the capacity to command the world into art. That admiration can be uneasy because capacity is morally neutral. It can build tombs. It can build prisons. It can build palaces. The Taj is a palace for death, and that is an uncomfortable sentence no matter how luminous the marble looks at sunrise. Then there is the 5th echo, the way time turns private sorrow into public entertainment. Shah Jahan's grief was personal, heavy, consuming, yet today his grief is, in a sense, part of a tourism economy, part of a global itinerary, part of wedding photo fantasies and honeymoon dreams. People smile in front of his monument. They pose, they flirt, they treat the tomb as backdrop. They are not cruel. They are human. Humans use beauty to decorate their lives, but the transformation is still haunting. A place built as a sanctuary for mourning now functions as a playground for memory making. It is not disrespectful so much as it is inevitable. This is what time does. It takes what was once sacred to one person and makes it accessible to millions. It democratizes grief by turning it into iconography. And iconography is less sharp than real paint. The Taj, in becoming universal, loses some of its original intimacy. That loss is the monument's salvation, because it ensures survival, but it is also the monument's final betrayal of its creator, because it escapes him. It becomes bigger than his intent. It becomes the world's mirror, not his. The 6th echo is perhaps the most poignant of all. The Taj's beauty is inseparable from its fragility. White marble does not remain white by itself. The world stains it: pollution, weather, the slow grime of living air. The monument must be cleaned, protected, maintained. Its purity is not natural. It is preserved. This is a quiet metaphor hiding in plain sight. The Taj is famous for purity, yet purity requires constant labor. Love is often described the same way: pure, eternal, unchanging. But anyone who has love knows love is not preserved by dreaming. It is preserved by work, by attention, by care. The Taj, ironically, teaches this lesson in stone. The most beautiful symbols require maintenance, or they decay. The world's idea of eternal love must be scrubbed, repaired, defended, because the world is always trying to mark it. That is the 7th echo. Love and monuments share a truth people prefer not to admit. Nothing remains pristine without effort, and even effort cannot stop change forever. So what is left when you stand there and let the monument speak beyond the romance? You are left with a question about why humans build it all. The Taj is an extreme example, but the impulse behind it is universal. We build to outlast ourselves. We build to prove that our feelings mattered. We build to make a mark so the universe cannot pretend we were never here. Some people build careers. Some build families, some build art, some build reputations, some, with empires behind them, build marble paradises on riverbanks. The scale differs, but the fear is the same, that the world will keep flowing and our love will be lost in the current. The Taj is a refusal of that fear. It is a hand reaching across centuries saying, remember, yet the deeper lesson might be gentler than we expect. The Taj does not actually defeat mortality. It coexists with it. It stands beside a river that keeps moving. It glows at sunrise and darkens at night. It is cleaned and repaired and guarded, and still it will one day be weathered beyond repair. Its eternity is borrowed, not absolute, and in that borrowed eternity is a strange comfort. Perhaps the goal was never to defeat death completely. Perhaps the goal was simply to create a moment of beauty strong enough to make grief bearable. Perhaps the monument was not a victory over mortality, but a way of living with it, turning pain into something that could be looked at without breaking. If so, then the Taj is less a romance and more a survival strategy, a way of saying, I cannot keep her alive, but I can keep my love from turning into nothing. I can give it shape. I can give it light. I can give it a place where strangers will still feel something, even if they do not know exactly what they are feeling. And that brings us to the final philosophical aftertaste, the one that ties together every gilded cage we have walked through, from seaside palaces built to silence rivals, to mountaintop castles built to command attention, to marble tombs built to make grief glow. The question is not whether these buildings are beautiful. The question is, what kind of hunger beauty is being asked to feed? Is it feeding love or ego? Is it feeding memory or fear? Is it feeding peace or performance? And if you can build anything, if you can spend fortunes, summon artisans, carve a dream into the earth, can you build the one thing every human truly wants? Inner stillness. Or will the monument, no matter how perfect, always echo back the same truth, that the only permanence we ever achieve is temporary? And the only freedom we ever find is in accepting that we cannot hold everything forever. The Taj glows, the river moves, people arrive, whisper, photograph, leave. The building remains, for now, as a luminous contradiction, love made stone, death made beautiful, power made tender, tenderness made public. And as you walk away, the echo follows you, not the echo of footsteps in a marble chamber, but the echo of a question that is older than any empire. In the end, everything we build, what exactly are we trying to prove, and to whom?